Good morning. Can I welcome members to the 6th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2013. Can I remind members and those in the public gallery to ensure that all electronic devices are switched off at all times, particularly mobile phones, because they do interfere with the sound system and it's not very helpful. Before moving on to the first item of business, we're hoping that Liam will be able to join us, but due to technical difficulties with his aircraft from Orkney, he may not make it this morning, so I think I'll give his apologies now just in case, but he may be able to join us, but it will be later on. The first item is consideration of whether to take items 3 and 4 in private. Are members agreed? Okay, thank you. Our next item today is our final oral evidence session on the Post-16 Education Scotland Bill. Before we take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary, can I welcome to the committee Mark Batho, who is the Chief Executive of the Scottish Funding Council. Thank you very much, Mr Batho, for coming along this morning. We're just going to go straight into questions, if that's all right. And I want to begin with Liz Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Mr Batho, when it comes to policies about university governance and tuition fees and access, etc., I wonder, could you give us your view on why you think a legislative approach would be better in terms of the delivery of education rather than the conditions which are already in existence when you make your grants?
I think clarity is the order of the day. We've obviously reflected on this in the Funding Council. Post the Putting Learners at the Centre report, there is a change in the policy environment for post-16. And from our perspective, it's not unhelpful actually to have a greater clarity around those issues that you've been talking about set out in legislation. I think everyone knows where they are a bit more clearly. At the moment, our duty, for example, with provision is to secure coherent provision, and that's it, really. And a bit of underpinning in the legislation around what that might look like, I think is certainly helpful to the Funding Council and potentially helpful to others.
Just to pick up your point, an interesting point you make about why you think there would be greater clarity as a result of this, could you be a bit more specific as to, because of that clarity, where exactly will this bill deliver the intentions? For example, what specific issues in the bill will deliver widened access? What specific things in the bill will actually lead to better governance? Could you just be a little bit more specific about your views on that?
Okay. On widening access, I won't go into the actual nitty-gritty of the specific provision because I understand that the government is looking at the detail of some of the wording of that. But in terms of the intent, that there should be clear agreements between the Funding Council and institutions around what their widening access ambition should be, and that ultimately there should be an obligation on those institutions to abide by them. I think actually setting that out gives an extra force to what's already there, which is what we're developing at the moment, our outcome agreements, which don't have, of course, any reference in statute at all. Outcome agreements just happen, they're agreements. And so I think having in the underpinning legislation that there is some sense of obligation to fulfil what is in what will be termed a widening access agreement is, I think, helpful. In terms of governance, again, of course, what the clause says is simply about agreement on the principles of governance. It's not that the Funding Council will tell universities how to run themselves, but it is about the underpinning principles. Again, at the moment, there is no real statutory reference to that. Of course, we have a direct interest in the Funding Council in well-governed institutions because we're distributing 1.6 billion of public money and we need to be sure that it's being used effectively and efficiently. And so I think that sense of having that statutory underpinning that makes it clearer what the obligation, if you like, of institutions to be well governed and well managed will contribute to greater accountability for that resource, and make sure that across the piece, across all institutions, that there is real compliance with the obligations that come with the amount of public funding that they get.
Right. Could I just take you back to the first part of your answer there, where you said that you didn't want to comment on the specific details because you felt that the government was still looking at some of that. Would it be your understanding that where the intentions of the bill are reasonably clear, the actual detail within how some of it would be put into practice is not clear?
I think I wasn't quite saying that. The point I was making was that the Cabinet Secretary has been indicating in a number of places that he would look at the wording in order to make sure that the intention which he's expressed is actually articulated in the right legal language. I'm not entirely sure where some of those discussions have got to, because I'm not directly in that loop. And so what I was talking about was that there was a clarity, for example, with the widening access clause, there is a clarity around what the government wants to see. Whether the actual wording is exactly the right wording at the moment is something that I understand that the Cabinet Secretary is looking at, and would, if required, bring amendments to the bill to Parliament if necessary, in order to make sure that any doubt about the wording is resolved. Not, as I say, my specific responsibility here. My responsibility is taking the legislation as we ultimately find it and implementing it.
Yes. Mr. Sim from University of Scotland said to us at committee last week that it was his belief that many people in that sector felt that the policy intentions had come adrift, I think was his phrase, from some of the detail. It's not for me to ask you, it wouldn't be right for you to answer on whether you think that is correct, but do you acknowledge that there is concern about that?
I've read the evidence that others have given. I don't have concern myself. I can see clearly the direction of the policy travel, and it's a direction which the Funding Council feels comfortable with.
Yes. Could I just ask you then, if you are prepared to say that, why you think that University of Scotland has made that comment? I don't think I want to enter into University of Scotland mind on that. I can't remember the exact specific that they were talking about. It was something to do with the whether it was an agreement or whether it was an enforcement or something like this. Yeah, well,
but that's really for them to articulate. I think
it was in the context of the next question that I'd like to deal with, and that is whether you feel that there is a concern about the degree of autonomy within the sector, responsible autonomy, which I think is the key phrase that's been used. Do you feel that within any parts of the bill that the oversight of ministers is increasing, and therefore your role in the Scottish Funding Council would be more to be at the government's bidding and to carry out more of their instructions rather than to allow that responsible autonomy? I think that was the point Mr. Sim was making.
Mm-hmm. I don't see that shift in the bill. I mean, the starting point is the clear articulation that ministers have made of their respect for the autonomy of institutions and their acknowledgement that autonomy actually delivers the best results if one looks at international comparisons. So that's the starting point. In terms of whether the bill intrudes upon that autonomy in ways that could actually affect it at all, that's not how we in the Funding Council have been reading the bill. If one wanted to intrude on autonomy and have the government take a more significant role in running particularly universities I'm talking about here, these are slightly odd ways of approaching it in terms of particularly the governance clause and the widening access clause. Now, when I say that, I'm conscious, of course, across the rest of the bill that the government is taking a more significant role in the appointment of the chairs of the regional strategic bodies and of the other regional colleges. That's a matter of process. Does that actually mean that these institutions are going to be less autonomous because of the route by which their chairs have been appointed? That's a matter of judgment, and some people who have given evidence have formed one view. I think I would form another view on that.
Just to be clear, Mr. Bathurst, I mean, the EIS is very much one group who has raised that concern, making the point that they feel that that good governance would be more at the discretion of ministers rather than at the discretion of the institutions. Is that something that concerns you?
I think there's a general interest in there being good governance by whatever route. If you've got chairs of colleges and regional bodies being appointed by an acknowledged public appointments process, it seems to me that that's an entirely legitimate route for institutions that are typically in receipt of about 70% of their funding from the public purse.
And just my final question, Convener. That point, I think, is very valid, that obviously they are taking a very substantial amount of money, and good governance is absolutely crucial. I think the point that many people in the college sector are making, however, is that good governance would be decided more by the government and potentially by the Scottish Funding Council, who obviously is involved in that process, rather than by the institutions. Would you accept the comments? Because they're quite substantial, these comments we've had.
I think government and the Funding Council has a legitimate interest in scrutinising the governance of institutions. That is different from doing the governance of institutions.
Including the powers to remove the whole board?
My understanding is that those powers exist in the 1992 Act already.
But they're slightly extended.
I'm getting beyond my...
That there are powers, but I think they find that they are to be extended. Is that something that would concern you?
Ultimately, if an institution which is in receipt of tens of millions, an institution, tens of millions of public money, is failing in its responsibilities, it is not unreasonable for there to be accountability for that. And if ultimately the sanction, which has never been used, of course, if ultimately the sanction is the removal of a board which presumably would be persistently failing to fulfill its duties and responsibilities, then that seems to me not an unreasonable sanction. But there are, of course, many steps along the way, which is why the process has never actually been carried through since the 92 Act.
Thank you very much. Neil Finlay.
Throughout the evidence that we've had during the scrutiny of this bill, we have had concern after concern raised about different elements of it. What concerns do you have about the bill?
The specifics that we've been talking to the Scottish Government about have been very much linked to our own responsibilities, and that's to make sure that there are clear lines of accountability for the resource that we distribute. I'm ultimately, personally, the accountable officer for all of that resource, all of that 1.6 billion accountable to the Scottish Parliament. And therefore it's important that there is a clarity of the line of that accountability down to where that resource ends up. And now for most of the college sector, and I'm talking about the college sector here, that's going to be very clear anyway, because in most areas there is going to be a single regional college. Particularly, and actually in the Highlands and Islands area, there will be clarity as well, because there will be a single UHI that will be ultimately responsible for all the resource. So the two areas where there's going to be multi-region colleges are at the moment Lanarkshire and Glasgow. And we have raised with the Scottish Government, and the discussions are continuing. It's essentially a technical point. This isn't something that's policy-wise. It's a question of just making sure that it's right. That within the legislation, as the resource moves from the Funding Council to the regional strategic body to be then distributed to the assigned colleges, that let me give an example. If something were to go wrong in one of the assigned colleges for which I was accountable financially, then there ought to be clarity around our capacity as the Funding Council to actually resolve the difficulties or the issues in that particular assigned college. Now, there are a number of ways of addressing that, either through legislation or administratively, potentially, for example, creating someone in the regional strategic body as an accountable officer as well. A number of different approaches which are being discussed at the moment. So I wouldn't put them as concerns, but I'd say things to be got right. And I think that's the main area. The one other one I would say is to make sure that there is clarity of who does what, particularly in relation to quality and in relation also to the securing of coherent provision within a region. Who is responsible in terms of the Funding Council and the regional strategic body? Again, I think those are potentially resolvable by administrative means, potentially through amendment to the statute. Discussions are continuing. They are technical, but it's important that there's clarity about them.
6 times I've heard you say this morning the word clarity. That's 6 times more than anybody has used that word in relation to this bill and all the evidence that we've heard, because nobody has said that this bill provides clarity on anything. So, in terms of your concern, you don't really have any concerns that, despite the weight of evidence that we've had that you say you've read, that it's only minor technical concerns that the Funding Council has about governance and all the rest of it, and that you would only comment on the narrow parts that relate to your organisation, is that right?
I think that's right, yes.
Okay. What about the Funding Council? Within the Prądzyński review, it was recommended that the Funding Council commission the drafting of the governance code. Why did that not happen?
I don't know the answer to how we've arrived at the process that has been agreed. But you're the chair of the Funding Council. Your organisation was tasked with coming up with the commissioning the code and didn't do it. So why did that not happen? I think there was discussion between University of Scotland and the government around an approach to doing this. And it was agreed that, that as now, where the Committee of University Chairs on a UK basis have drafted the existing guidance, so the opportunity should be given to the chairs of the Scottish higher education institutions to draft a Scottish code. And that's what's happening at the moment. We're entirely comfortable about that.
So you think that happened, or that's what happened?
That's my, well, I'm sorry, I wouldn't be definitive because I haven't got a clear picture in my mind.
But surely, if your organisation was asked to carry out the review, commission the review, did the government speak to you about that? Well,
we weren't, of course, asked. The von Prądzyński report was a recommendation
so there was
to government.
Just to be absolutely clear on this, there was no discussion between the Funding Council and the government about the Funding Council commissioning that review?
Not to my recollection.
Thank you. But following on for that then, does that concern you in any way?
Our concern is about making sure that there is proper governance. I come back to that point again, fundamentally, so that there is proper accountability for the resource that goes out to institutions. We obviously deal closely with University of Scotland at all times, and we deal closely with the government at all times. As the university chairs produce their recommendations on governance, I have no doubt that the Funding Council will be involved in the discussions of what they produce, as will the Scottish Government, and we'll have an input into any areas that we think need to be improved, could be added to, or whatever.
Have you been involved so far?
No, because this is a matter that the university chairs are at the moment pursuing themselves. They're the people that have been tasked with pulling together this guidance.
Yeah, but they told us last week that they have been consulting with various, well, they claimed they were consulting. Other people said they haven't been consulting. So to date they've not consulted with you?
We haven't had a formal meeting with that review group yet, but of course their work's continuing.
Thank you. Are you concerned about the lack of parliamentary scrutiny of the Code of Governance?
I'm not concerned. If Parliament is concerned, then I would accept that entirely. Since we haven't seen that code yet, we need to see what it looks like. If Parliament felt it should have a role, that's not for me to comment on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Perhaps just following on from what Mr Finlay was saying there, when this Code of Conduct is actually produced, who's actually going to sign off on it?
As things stand, it will be a voluntary code which the autonomous institutions will themselves sign up to. Now, if the clause in the bill that talks about governance comes into effect, the government could actually ask for a review of particular aspects of the principles which underpin governance of universities, at which point government would plainly have an interest in all of that. But in a voluntary code, as things stand at the moment, the sign-off is by the institutions themselves. We have a financial memorandum which is agreed with both sectors, colleges and universities. And under the terms of that memorandum, we require good governance. And underpinning that is actually whether institutions are complying with the existing code. So in direct answer to your question, there is the sign-off is about a voluntary code by the universities. We will obviously be looking at that code. If from a funding council perspective, that code is delivering what the existing code is covering, and we're satisfied it provides good governance, then our job is then to make sure on a regular basis that institutions are complying with it.
Okay, just moving on to the written evidence supplied by Professor Russell Griggs. I'm looking at a comment here where he refers to the report and says, "We were not convinced that those who set targets or monitors colleges were equipped to create and manage an outcome system well, and I still have concerns in that area." Perhaps you might want to comment on that?
Yeah, I read that last night. We've been moving very quickly to outcome agreements that for the academic year 12-13, which we're still in, because of the way that the policy development unfolded, we only started that process really about a year ago. We've already been doing the academic year 13-14 outcome agreements in order to get them in place in time for universities and colleges to have the appropriate planning assumptions in front of them well before the start of the academic year. So it's been quite a fast and learning process. And in that process, we, as Russell Griggs acknowledges, have been learning, but we've also been obliged to move quite fast in terms of getting some hard edge to these outcome agreements in fairly quick order. That's meant that because by their nature outcomes tend to be quite long-term, you have to get some intermediate measures. Sometimes they're inputs, so that what is this university actually doing to achieve a particular objective on, for example, knowledge exchange. Sometimes they're outputs. What are the first results showing? And so, to an extent, we're getting to that level of fine-grainedness or granularity and having to concentrate on that in the early stages of outcome agreements. But in our guidance letter, the Cabinet Secretary has made it very clear that he sees outcome agreements being a rolling process covering a number of years. In other words, he is envisaging that we move much more to the monitoring of the development of outcome agreements, the clean water out of Russell Griggs's pipe, in fact, in his evidence. And that's very much the direction of travel of the Funding Council.
To what extent have the outcoming agreements that you've been producing been the subject of negotiation on both sides? Is there a good negotiation there?
Absolutely, yes. They have, in every case, been negotiated. We have reorganised our own staffing structures to make sure that there are people assigned to particular regions in terms of colleges and to groups of universities as well, who have been conducting absolutely what I would term as a negotiation. Not always easy negotiations. Some of them have been really quite tough, and some institutions are more happy or less happy than the way those things have gone. And where there is unhappiness, we seek to resolve that. I'm going out this Friday to an institution, I won't name it, but where there is some unhappiness about the way the process has gone, to see what underpins that unhappiness, whether we can do things to resolve it in a very pragmatic way.
Thank you. Liz, sorry, Liz, before we'll get two members who want to come in, but we have to move on, but quick questions.
Just a point of clarity. Last week, it was very clear when we spoke with the chairs of the universities that they were not the ones who were making the decision about the new code of governance, that they were effectively setting up the steering group and that there would be a consultation process. I think I'm right. Can I just clarify? You said that the Funding Council, the government and the universities themselves would all be involved in that process once the draft appears in April. Is that correct?
I would expect that to be the case, and others, including the National Union of Students and the trade union side probably as well.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm not being definitive about this. I'm not making a process up here.
No, that's your understanding.
But that's my understanding.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Neil Bibby.
You mentioned that the code would be voluntary and universities could sign up to it if they wanted. Are you sure about that? Because the impression I got was different.
I was saying that there isn't a compulsory code of guidance that everybody has to abide, that there is a sort of statutory obligation to abide by it. But the point I was making is that because we require good governance in the Funding Council as a condition of our grant, through our financial memorandum, that there is an existing code in place, so when there's a new code, we would, to all intents and purposes, require that all institutions are signed up to it. So it isn't a voluntary, well, I don't think I'll sign up to this code, I'll go and do something else. The obligations will be to, once this code is in place, that we will expect all institutions whom we fund to abide by the terms of the code. And if they don't, then we have, we will expect an obligation, we will require the universities to explain why not.
Sorry, how is that voluntary if you're requiring them to sign up to the code?
I'm saying it isn't a statutory code, that's my point. But if you have got a code that has been agreed by the universities as the method of governance by which they will operate, then we come in and say, okay, you've agreed that that's the way that you wish to, that you think universities should be governed. We, as a funding council, having scrutinised that, agree that that is acceptable for our purposes, and now we expect, as a condition of grant, that you'll comply with that code. That's how it operates at the moment.
Yeah. So what? It begs the question: why would you need legislation for that?
Well, I hesitate to use the word clarity again, since there's a word count on it. But nevertheless, I think it is helpful that there should be continuing scrutiny of this. Nothing is forever in terms of governance, particularly in a very changing environment. And so it's useful if actually there are those that perceive that there is a weakness in the way that governance is now operating at some point in the future, that there should be an opportunity to look again at some of the principles and to take action accordingly.
Okay, thank you. Neil's got a very brief point.
Alan Simpson, University of Stirling, said, we believe that the principles of good governance should be developed in a collegial manner with the sector through discussions. However, the bill says Scottish ministers will have the power to impose. Is that news to you?
Can I just look at the
official report?
The clause I'm looking at, which is the section 2. It says, Scottish ministers may impose a condition that the council must, when making a payment to higher education institutions, require the institution to comply with the principles of governance and management. So that's where the imposition comes in. It's saying, impose a condition that when we make payment, we're making sure that the institutions comply.
So isn't this part of the problem with this bill, that you take one slant on it and we've got the universities saying something else? Therefore, there's clearly confusion over what the heck is going on here. Or different interpretations. Let me be charitable, as I always am.
Well, there are, I mean, as a statement of fact, there are different interpretations that have been presented in front of the committee.
Okay, thank you. Can I just clarify something then? What is the difference, or is there a difference between the way that it operates under the current code with how you envisage it would operate under the new code?
Not significantly, no.
Effectively, the way that the process works is it the same?
That there is a code at the moment that we expect, as a funding council, we expect universities to comply with as effectively a condition of grant.
So yeah, so it's okay. I think that's reasonably clear.
This is clarity.
Well, I think it is, Neil. George Adam.
I've just wanted to ask one of the questions, obviously one of the biggest discussions, one of the biggest challenges and exciting part of the bill as well is the widening access. We've discussed some of it already. There's been some discussion over that over the past kind of time we've had in front of us at the committee. Now, university principals are effectively saying there's nothing to see here, as did the chairs as well of court. The NUS say that it would take 40 years to get to the level of access that we need to be at within universities. I think in the past 10 years there's only been about a 1% change on people from lower socio-economic backgrounds. So how will the bill widen access, in your opinion, or can you give me some clarity on how it would widen access, and is there an expected improvement?
I think what the bill does is make a very clear statement that universities are now going to be expected to improve their performance in this respect. Because you're right, there has been very slow progress on this front. Different people will offer different reasons for that, but the fact is that progress has been very slow, and that across the piece the performance of institutions in Scotland is not as good as the performance in other parts of the United Kingdom. And ministers are plainly responding to that by saying that from a policy perspective, they want increased pressure now to come onto the universities to improve the position. That's partly come about, of course, for the coming academic year, where we, in response to the guidance from the government, are creating additional places for widening access, which we've put out to institutions which we'll be monitoring very carefully to make sure that, firstly, those places are filled, and secondly, that there isn't displacement activity in the filling of them. In other words, that there is an increase in the amount of widening access as a result of that extra investment.
That was my next question with regards to displacement. You know, there's been much said as well that there will be a displacement of the students. What would be your opinion with regards? What is the way forward with using the bill as to deal with the display or potential displacement?
Fundamentally, we need to see more students coming from areas of deprivation than in the past. And we can monitor at a certain level within the Funding Council where students are coming from and where they're going to. And if there is evidence of displacement within, for example, Glasgow, I just use that as a major conurbation with a number of institutions there, then I think we would be getting in amongst the numbers with the individual institutions and asking questions. What we actually want to see is more people from the more deprived parts of Glasgow going to university where they have the capacity to thrive in a university environment.
One of the things that I'd have to agree from the point of view that I've seen some of the representations from some of the institutions and they could do with a wee bit of a demographic shake-up. But on the side of retention was one of the big issues that's come up as well. It's not just making sure someone gets access,
Yes.
it's retaining them as well. And I've mentioned UWS and Paisley have been quite good at getting 20% of people from lower socio-economic backgrounds, but retention is still a challenge for them. So how do you see that going in the future then?
It's got to be absolutely a part of the widening access programme. And as we engage in outcome agreements with the universities, so retention is an integral part of that. It's just simply not acceptable for the individual students particularly to be pulled into university and to find themselves without adequate support. So widening access and retention are two sides of the coin as far as the Funding Council is concerned, and will be, as we go through the outcome agreement monitoring process, looking at that very carefully.
Currently, in the current budget, there is extra money. There is some money for new places, isn't
Yes.
there? What exactly was that amount again? Sorry.
Let's see. Sorry, I haven't got the figure in my head. What I've got is the numbers. We put about 700 new places in for 13-14 for widening access, and just over 1,000 for articulation. Articulation being moving into second or third year of a degree programme when you've got a higher national certificate or a higher national diploma, which is of itself actually a widening access measure, because typically that is a strong entry route into university for people from non-typical backgrounds, if I can put it that way.
And it is the route my own daughter might be taking as well,
Yeah.
so I'm aware of that. Route.
Yeah, and actually there's been very strong demand from the universities for particularly the articulation places. And I'm sorry, I just haven't got the figure in my head for the extra resource that we're putting in. But I can certainly, I can write to the committee with those figures.
Thank you very much. Neil Bibby and then Liz Smith.
Why do you believe legislation is necessary to ensure widening access? Why, for example, could the Scottish Funding Council not use a compliance clause or condition of grant in its current funding arrangements?
I think we could, but putting it in legislation does give it that extra sense of force. It gives a clear and strong signal that this is not a short-term commitment, but a long-term commitment by government, by Parliament, to improve widening access. So I think it is an extra sense of commitment by the government to this. That's how I'd describe it. And I come back to the point that actually the kind of methods that you've been describing so far haven't really worked. They have not increased access from the more deprived parts of Scotland to a level that either government or the Funding Council would have wished to have seen. So while it is to some extent a signal, nevertheless, it is a signal with some teeth in that we can actually use in the Funding Council the fact that there is a statutory provision behind the widening access agreements to give extra force to our, if you like, enforcement of the figures that universities are agreeing.
And you, following any legislation, you would use a condition of grant to enforce widening access in universities?
If that is required.
So you would do what you already could do just now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What have you had discussions about what the actual levels of increase that you intend through the widening access agenda in terms of how many people you anticipate seeing to go to legislation, seeing going to university following legislation? Are there any?
I don't think we haven't actually got into figures at the moment. There's been a long-term programme of seeking to widen access through the widening access hubs that have operated between universities and colleges. But I wouldn't be prepared to, well, I'm not in a position to name a target right now, and I think it would be a moving target anyway, because there'll be a range of different interventions, including, as I say, that articulation, those articulation places, which I hope will raise the game as we move through the process of increasing the number of places. And of course, those places will continue to increase year on year over a 4-year period throughout the 4 years of the degree. So, in other words, this is a significant ramping up of the widening access places in universities. And as we also ramp up the widening articulation, our hope and expectation is that universities will improve their own practices in order that they don't fall short of what they're committed to in terms of both how they actually reach out to students and then how they retain them, coming back to George Adams' point as well, and that will itself then create a circumstance in which universities actually get better at widening access, because that fundamentally is what needs to happen.
Liz Smith.
Just to be clear, Mr Bathu, when you mentioned the target, is it your understanding that there is likely to be a national target for this, or is it targets that are within each of the outcome agreements within the different universities?
My expectation is that we will continue to negotiate with the universities targets
so
for
specific
their
to the university,
performance.
Right? Obviously, we've had it put to us, particularly by the 4 principals who attended committee, that the method that is used to define those in poorer backgrounds is perhaps a little too narrow, and it's not sufficient when it comes to all the things you should be looking at. Would you accept that that is a fair assumption that's made?
I think using the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation Areas 20 and 40 is a good start, but it doesn't capture significant pockets of deprivation in perhaps rural communities and others, which is one of the significant points that the university principals have been making to us as well. So I think it is good to get a good start using the SIMD 20 and 40 data, because there are strong correlations that operate there. But I think everybody is acknowledging that if we can get a more sophisticated methodology that, if I can put it slightly crudely, doesn't let universities off the hook, but actually does deliver the objective, which is that people from wherever in Scotland they are, coming from deprived backgrounds, have the same opportunity to move into university, then of course that's a goal worth pursuing.
Right. Yeah, I entirely agree. There's no question. I think everybody is agreed that we have to do more. But if we accept the evidence that was given to us by the principals of Edinburgh, of Strathclyde, of Stirling and of the Glasgow School of Art, they were all saying that by widening the approach to the measure, they were already, never mind having legislation, they were already improving the facility for students from poorer backgrounds to attend their institutions. What I'm interested in is if this can be achieved by the rigorous process that you've referred to within the outcome agreements as it stands, why do we need that extra legislation?
I come back to the point that I was making earlier. Fundamentally, I think that there is extra capacity for us to engage in effective negotiations with institutions if it's backed up by there being a statutory provision to which we can refer. We can negotiate better results in terms of widening access through our outcome agreement negotiations if we have a clause like the one in the bill than if there isn't one there.
Okay. Thank you. Neil Finlay.
Yeah, in terms of college regionalisation, we see two distinct and separate funding models emerging, and a number of witnesses have raised concerns about particularly regional boards and whether this additional level of bureaucracy is required, and about confusion over funding and whose role is what and all the rest of it. I wonder if you'd care to comment on that.
In given the focus of putting learners at the centre and moving forward to the policy we're now pursuing with regionalisation generally, that the objective is that college education should be planned and delivered on a regional basis because it makes sense economically, it makes sense for students. You've got to have in every region some means of being able to take that strategic overview of what the requirements are for the legislation, what the economic demands are, and a regional place in which discussions with stakeholders such as business can take place. So in the two areas where there isn't going to be a single regional college, Glasgow and Lanarkshire, there has got to be some kind of place where that can get focused. And one of the concerns about the existing structure of colleges was that for very good reasons and with a lot of good effect, but nevertheless some downsides, they found it quite difficult to stretch their horizons to that regional level. They concentrated very much on their local market. And so you've got to have some, if you're going to have a regional approach in Glasgow, in Lanarkshire, you've got to have some kind of capacity to think regionally that isn't constantly referring back to the smaller boundaries of the individual colleges. And so I think, therefore, that concept of having some kind of regional strategic body is the right one. There's a lot of discussion still got to take place about how big that should be, how much resource it should consume. And I think the government's been signalling that it doesn't want these to be big, huge new layers of bureaucracy consuming resource that would otherwise be going into frontline educational services. And the trick is going to be, as we move through this process, to identify how you can get those two things of a relatively uncostly administration at regional level, but one which has the capacity actually to think regionally and to distribute the provision across the regional colleges in a way that works for the students and works for the businesses in the area. It's not an easy ask, but that's the next task, if you like.
You think this has become a bit messy and confused? That's certainly what all of the people who are giving us evidence are telling us. Almost all.
Across most of the country, aside from those two areas, I'd say that there is much more... Sorry, I nearly used the word. I really must stop it.
It's good to hear that word. We've not heard it in this committee.
There is going to be a much more focused delivery of college education in the regions. There is a risk in Lanarkshire and Glasgow that it could get messy, but there is, I think, also an opportunity to make sure that it doesn't. And it's a question of getting the right balance between the assigned colleges, 3 at the moment in Glasgow and a slightly moving feast in Lanarkshire, getting that balance so that you don't get an intrusive bureaucracy that is costly, but which does nevertheless give the businesses in Glasgow, the businesses in Lanarkshire, a real point of focus where they can talk about Lanarkshire and the needs of Lanarkshire, the needs of Glasgow.
At the moment at Edinburgh College, we're seeing the impact of regionalisation on local access, the closure of the construction section in Midlothian, and that is a concern that a number of us have raised in terms of local access. Do you have concerns about local access provision moving to this model?
I wouldn't put it as concerns. I think it's an issue that's got to be watched and managed very carefully, because we've always said that particularly with non-advanced further education, the capacity of some students to travel very significantly, or their willingness to travel, is limited. And so on a regional model, that is something that's got to be managed. Now, whether it is through the provision of minibus services, as has been talked of in Edinburgh, whether it's actually the provision of maybe non-advanced centres, and then as people move through their learning and reach more advanced levels, having a greater expectation that they'll travel, that's for the regional college to sort out. But in our outcome agreements with them, we will be making it clear that we expect access to provision to be a part of the overall regionalisation.
Would you accept then that in that specific example that I give is likely to reduce access for people in Midlothian and East Lothian? Is that
unless it's managed properly?
Thank you.
Okay, Neil Bibby.
You mentioned earlier that you had technical concerns between the relationships between assigned colleges and regional strategic bodies.
Yes.
And then just there you've said that there's a risk that it could get messy in Glasgow and Lanarkshire. What would happen in your view if there was a dispute between an assigned college and a regional strategic body? Who would step in? Who would decide who was right and who was wrong? If things were to get messy.
The role of the regional strategic body is to plan provision on a regional basis. And so they have the authority to do that. Now, the nature of the power of the regional body, the regional strategic body in the bill, is such that, in a way, it's replacing the powers of the Funding Council in those two areas, in Glasgow and Lanarkshire. So I think the answer to your question is that the regional strategic body will have that authority. That's the way that it will work. As I don't think I was saying it could get messy, by the way, just to do the thing. I was saying that there is a potential for it to become messy, but the work that needs to go on now is to ensure that it doesn't become messy. Messiness is not an absolute result of what's proposed in the bill. It doesn't have to be.
And in terms of your understanding, if you're saying it could be a sort of mini Scottish Funding Council in Glasgow and Lanarkshire, would have those many funding councils. In terms of ministerial powers and government powers over mismanagement that you referred to earlier, and would they be if there was a dispute between an assigned college and a regional strategic body, would that wouldn't be your responsibility? That would be the government's responsibility.
If there was in one of the assigned colleges in, say, Lanarkshire, that there was something that had gone wrong in terms of mismanagement, say, ultimately, in terms of the bill, that would be that comes back to my point about accountability. Where will the accountability lie? But as the bill is drafted at the moment, it would be the responsibility of the regional strategic body to resolve that mismanagement. That's where the authority will lie.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you. You spoke at length about accountability earlier in your evidence, and especially for the £1.6 billion that you're responsible for in actual delivery. Are you confident that the regionalisation model improves the accountability that's there had it not gone ahead?
I think it has the potential across. Can I separate the country into those with regional strategic bodies and those with regional colleges, first of all? With regional colleges, the lines of accountability will be much the same, but there will be fewer colleges. I think that actually simplifies and improves accountability. In the two areas where there will be regional strategic bodies and the assigned colleges, there is the opportunity to make sure that the accountability remains at least as clear at the moment, though with the risk that other members have been talking about, that if it were not got right, that accountability could be blurred, and others have given that evidence. So the job is to make sure that that accountability is delivered through this model.
Can you tell me how the Funding Council will engage with the FE Strategic Forum and what that will mean for the regions?
My understanding is that the FE Strategic Forum is still, the nature of it is still up for discussion. So just who will be on it, how it will operate, it is still being discussed by government. So until I see the nature of the beast, I don't think I can really answer your question.
Thank you.
Final question from Joan McAlpine.
And in terms of your ability to review FE and higher education, I understand that the bill enshrines your ability to do that, but university principals did express some concern about the possible impact of reviews on their ability to determine course provision. How would you respond to their concerns?
I would say that we already do review provision because we are required to secure coherent provision. Mm-hmm. That does mean looking at whether the right provision is in the right place at a national level. There's nothing in the clause that says that we would be doing anything other than that. And it seems to me an entirely reasonable thing to do, in particularly given that public resources are always limited, to make sure that the provision across our university system and indeed the college system is the best that it can be for the resource that's put in. That has to be an obligation. And this isn't about the Funding Council going in and closing medieval French at Edinburgh University, but it would be about engaging in discussion with universities, as we did a while back in relation to modern languages, to say, can we make sure collectively that we have an understanding that there is good provision for Scottish students and for the good of Scotland in our universities, and that there isn't undue duplication, and that if a university were to decide to close, for example, its Japanese department, that Scotland wouldn't lose out as a result. So can we have some kind of system in place that says there will be an overview that is constantly kept, because universities move in and out of courses the whole time. They close departments, they open departments according to demand. So can we just have an overview and make sure that at any given point, if there are concerns emerging, we can look at the overall picture and make recommendations to the universities, apart from anything else.
Sure. So what you seem to be saying is that you already have this ability, but the bill, in a sense, and you have used it, as you've illustrated in the case of modern languages, and the bill sort of tidies that up. Would that be accurate?
It again sends, it goes beyond the words secure coherent provision, which aren't exactly to the average reader particularly clear about what they mean. It does articulate the strategic role of the Funding Council in the overall management of provision across Scotland in a way that I think is helpful.
Sure. And just one last question on that point. In putting learners at the centre of the government's pre-legislative paper, they quote work by you where you say that there's too much duplication and unnecessary competition between colleges and universities. How damaging has that been?
In times of plenty, not too damaging. Though I think it's never desirable to have wasteful competition. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we should have one university that should deliver medieval French and no other. Competition is good and helpful, and not least because when we deal in subject names, engineering, medieval French or whatever, actually often the offerings between different institutions are a bit different. They're tackling different aspects of it. So it's not a black and white kind of approach to this. So, but nevertheless, there has been, particularly I think within the college system, where you did get colleges quite close to each other, competing for students for really exactly the same course, which wasn't the best use of money. And as the overall fiscal circumstances have tightened, okay, universities have had a reasonable settlement over the last 3 years, but money is still not growing on trees. I think it just makes sense to try and identify those and to work with the providers to say, is this the best way of doing things?
And how damaging was that for students in terms of the college sector, this competition for students? Was it damaging for the outcomes for the individual students in any way?
Yeah, I'd hope not, because our quality mechanisms do make sure that even if there is competition, that competition has got to be of a reasonable quality for the individual student.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I thank you, Mr Bartow, for coming along this morning and giving your most helpful evidence on the bill, and can I suspend briefly? Can I welcome to the committee this morning Michael Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning, Michael Cross, Deputy Director, Colleges and Adult Learning Division, Tracy Slavin, Deputy Director, Higher Education and Learner Support, Gavin Gray, Team Leader, Bill Team, and Ailsa Heine, Senior Principal Legal Officer, Directorate for Legal Services, all from Scottish Government. Good morning to you all. And can I invite you, Cabinet Secretary, to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. I should say at the start that this is an ambitious bill, which has at its heart making the system better for the people who matter most, our learners. It's been designed to support the key objectives of our post-16 reforms, to improve the life chances of our young people, to support Scotland's economic ambitions, and to create a more sustainable and secure system. It will do this by putting in place a new structure which will help make colleges more responsive to the needs of learners and employers. It will support our ambitions to widen access to higher education and to deliver opportunities for all. It will ensure that we can have confidence that our significant investment in post-16 education, which is over £2.5 billion a year, is delivering the best possible outcomes. The evidence presented to the committee so far appears to reflect this. The evidence sessions I've seen have focused on the overarching policy goals the bill seeks to deliver. I expect members may want to pursue similar lines of inquiry this morning. I've been pleased to note that the evidence so far has been supportive of the principles behind the bill. The clear message is that the solutions we have identified to improve governance, widen access and make a better system for learners are the right ones. There's a great deal of common ground over this bill, but I do not for a moment wish to suggest that there is complete consensus over every provision. It would be an extremely unusual piece of legislation were that so. So I have been and am listening very carefully to all that's been said, both through the committee's considerations, in my own discussions with universities, colleges, staff, students and others. I have been and will take full account of all interests and perspectives on how this legislation could be improved, as all legislation can be improved during the legislative process. Where there are differences and disagreements, these largely centre on the interpretation of how certain provisions will work in practice, rather than the fundamental principles at the heart of the legislation. Indeed, I think even the strongest critics of a particular provision are often able to wholeheartedly agree with the goals that the provision seeks to achieve. Where there are differences and suggestions for improvement, so I'm putting on record my commitment to working with partners, including this committee, to produce the best possible piece of legislation, one that will deliver real benefits for learners. I'm also clear that it is a partnership that has got us this far. We've been through an extensive period of consultation. We have discussed the issues involved in this bill all over the place. And it's right that the bill should be a product of continuing partnership. Now, Convener, I hope that that brief statement has been helpful to the committee. I am passionate about Scottish learners and about learning in Scotland. I believe this bill delivers real benefits in that regard. I have put forward, I think, a clear case for reform, and the bill is an essential part of the process. I welcome the scrutiny of the legislation. It's critical that we work together to make it as strong as it can be, and I'm happy to have questions from members.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. We've got a lot to get through, as you can imagine, this morning, so I want to move straight into questions from members of the committee, and I want to begin with Liz Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, notwithstanding that I think you're right, I think the general direction of what is being attempted is not in doubt. Have you been surprised by the level of concern about many of the technical aspects of the bill and one or two substantive points?
No, I've been quite heartened by the evidence that you've received, because I think where there are concerns, we need to address them. And I think many of them have been addressed, and those that remain to be addressed, then I'm happy to do so. No doubt we'll touch on some of those. You've made a special concern about governance issues, and I think that we can look at the issue of responsible autonomy, for example, and make sure we have the exactly right wording to ensure that we have the right provisions within the bill. So I think the process we're engaged in is a positive one, and I'm going to be positive about it.
How would you respond to Alistair Sim last week, who said that he felt that the principles of the bill had come adrift from the detail of it?
Well, I disagree with Alan Sim on that. He's here, and I'm very happy to have a debate and a discussion with him. I meet him often. I disagree. I think the principles of the bill are entirely clear, and I think they're expressed in the legislation. As I understand the position of University of Scotland, there are a number of areas where they would like to see amendment. That is a discussion that can take place during stage 2. I think that the issues, the principles of the bill are very clear indeed. And indeed, those principles, I think, have been supported by University of Scotland and indeed were by the principals of the universities when they gave evidence to you.
How would you respond to the sectors, in both cases, actually colleges and universities, who feel that while they agree with the general direction, it is not actually necessary to legislate.
Well, I disagree. I mean, I think that very often, and I think I've been on your side of the table, I have to say, or the member's side of the table before, and said from the opposition, no, we don't need legislation. Actually, I think there is a need for legislation for a variety of reasons, which are outlined in the bill. I was looking this morning at Ferdinand von Brzezinski's report, and I was very struck by the quote which opens it from Sir William Hamilton, who said in 1835 that a university is a trust confided by the state to certain hands for the common interest of the nation, and then went on to say, a university may and ought by the state to be from time to time corrected, reformed or recast, looking towards an improved accomplishment of its essential ends. I think that's precisely what we're trying to achieve here, almost 200 years later. We're getting to an improved accomplishment of the ends of further and higher education. Now, there will always be a debate about how we do that, but I think the bill in principle is correct. I think the particular provisions are the provisions that will help, but they are never, and never are in a bill, cast absolutely perfectly or in stone. Let us have a debate about how we change those if they need to change.
Cabinet Secretary, I think there's a very important point here which Von Brzezinski echoes in his paper too, that some of the timings around this bill are difficult, not least we're being asked as a committee to decide whether to pursue legislation on the governance code, and yet that governing code doesn't actually exist, the new one. That's not coming, as we understand it, till April, and therefore, there's a piece of information there, Cabinet Secretary, that we don't actually have as a committee, so it makes our judgment rather difficult. And this is something that Professor Von Brzezinski has referred to in his paper. Would you accept that our job is...
Where would he refer to it in this paper?
In this paper, it's paragraph 4 of the paper that he provided to this committee just over the weekend, Convener.
I haven't seen that paper. Can I have sight of it? It'd be useful.
Cabinet Secretary.
Because I'd be happy to address the point. The code, of course, is not part of the legislation. The code is referred to in Von Brzezinski's report in the final recommendation.
Where I've said...
Hang on, 1 second.
Paragraph 4, I think it is.
Yes, this is...
Responds to a request for any further written information from
well, it's very, very useful.
And Professor Von Brzezinski.
I'm very happy that the code, when it is made available, and it is a document, of course, that is not within the legislation, I'm very happy that the committee discusses it. I think that's entirely appropriate. There have been occasions in the past where such a document is available to the committee at stage 2, and I understand it will be available. And I understand the convener has also, if I read the report of the committee has given a commitment that evidence should be taken on the code at that stage. That seems entirely appropriate. Indeed, because the code is based upon Von Brzezinski's principles, and we know that, and is referred to within it, then I think we're looking forward to seeing how these principles work out in that way. But of course, until the code exists, there is a code. It is the existing code, and that existing code will continue in operation until the new code is there.
With due respect, Cabinet Secretary, we're having to make this decision without seeing the new code. We're also having to make the decision in the understanding, I think, that there is another bill forthcoming in about 18 months to 2 years' time. Could you tell us what that second piece of legislation is intended to do?
If you read Von Brzezinski and you look at his recommendations, there are some very, very deep recommendations. This is, incidentally, a unanimous report, with the exception of 2 recommendations, which are both to do with the position of university chairs. So this is backed by the university chairs as well as everybody else. There are a number of recommendations in it that will require a very considerable period of time and work to put in place. One is the role of the Privy Council. The second one is the underpinning statute. Now, those could not be done very quickly. But I think there was an agreement across the sector, and certainly I read that agreement, and I think there was a wide agreement, that we should endeavour to move forward on the things that did not require that legislation without further delay. And that is why a whole number of these I have said I've accepted, and we're moving on them, including the code issue. Now, the code issue is one in which it says the Scottish Funding Council should commission the drafting of a code of good governance for further education institutions. That didn't happen because the university chairs of court volunteered before that happened to do the work on this. We accepted that initiative, and they have done the work on this, and this will come forward. But the bill itself, if I may quote the bill on this matter, which I think is important, and we should always seek to go back to the legislation. The bill itself, where it talks about the code, can you give me the section on the code? That's section 2. The Scottish Ministers may, under Section 9.2, impose a condition that the Council must, when making a payment to a higher education institution under Section 12.1, require the institution to comply with any principles of governance or management, and we can come back to that word in a minute, which appear to the Scottish Ministers to constitute good practice in relation to the higher education institutions. I have indicated that I think the best way to do that is to follow von Pronzinski, which is here, which is an independent report, and to have that code in place. Now, that code is in the process of development, will be provided, but it's not referred to in the bill. It's not referred to in the bill, and there is an existing code of good practice and governance which you received evidence to say would continue in existence. So I think that's a satisfactory way to proceed. I don't imagine that the chairs of court are going to be dreadfully subversive in that matter. And I think what we will get is a code which you are then, as a committee, I'm glad you're going to consider, and I'm glad you're going to take evidence on. And I think that is entirely in keeping with the scrutiny that should take place.
Cabinet Secretary, there is quite a serious issue here.
I'm treating it seriously.
This is not about any party line on this bill. This is to do with the actual process, and I appreciate for some reason you don't seem to have the von Pronzinski paper that we have. But he is raising some concern about some of the timescales. What I'm asking is that our job to scrutinise specific pieces of legislation, which may or may not be important in the final outcome, our difficulty is that we're being asked to do this in a scale where we, as I say, have some concern about a code of governance which is being produced at a later date and beyond, in fact, the intended start of stage 2. Plus, there is a second bill to come. And I don't think we're entirely clear as to the intention of that second bill.
Well, you don't have to be entirely clear to the intention of that second bill, because it's not the general principles of that bill you're considering at this time. You're considering the general principles of this bill, which are very clear on the issue of governance. And I've quoted it, and I would quote it again. And it says quite clearly that is what is going to take place if the bill is passed. Now, I think the code is the best way to move forward as a sort of bridging position between that and the recommendation that Ferdinand von Prince's committee has on a statute for Scotland's higher education sector setting out the key principles and serving as the legal basis. But in those circumstances, the code is something I have asked to be put in place. I have said will come to you. The committee has said it will take evidence on. I don't think I can say fairer than that. That's where it is. That's what's going to take place. I don't think it delays you for a moment on the principles of this bill. The principle is quite clear on this matter.
My final question on this point. This morning when we heard from Mark Batho, he was asked pretty consistently by members of the committee as to what would be different in terms of what happens now and what would happen in the situation post-legislation. In other words, what is it that is specific in the bill that will deliver a better outcome for the learners that you spoke about in your opening remarks? What are the specific issues when it comes to governance that will improve the situation?
Well, I think you need to go back to Ferdinand von Pronzinski's report. I think you need to look at the role of governance, and particularly the 4 characteristics of governance that he lays out, which are effective stewardship of the university to secure its sustainability over the medium and long term, safeguarding the mission of the university and the service it provides for the public benefit, securing the proper and effective use of public and other funds, and ensuring stakeholder participation and accounting to the wider society for institutional performance. I think all those 4 are enhanced by a variety of provisions within the bill, and that is what we intend to do.
Forgive me, Cabinet Secretary, what is it that will actually make the improvements? Where is the evidence that, firstly, that the governance of universities as they stand just now are not as good as they should be, and that the bill will actually deliver an improvement?
Well, the outcomes of governance in terms of widening access are not as good as they should be. I think Mr Finlay, in evidence, read out a list of the chairs of the courts and indicated perhaps that that was not as representative as group as it could be, and I think he's right. I think there are a whole range of issues addressed within the bill which are positive in terms of those changes, and I think the general principles of those are entirely clear.
Mr Batho said this morning that when it came to ensuring that there was widening access, that the outcome agreements which are already in place are already working well. And I quote him, he said they were rigorous and that he had or the Funding Council obviously had lots of discussions with individual universities, and he was satisfied that we're working well.
Absolutely, and it has been, in my view, the presence of the intention to legislate that has accelerated the process in widening access. Indeed, I don't think that is solely my point. I think that both National Union of Students and University and Colleges Union have made exactly that point, that we have had inadequate progress over a period of time. We are getting better progress as a result of the outcome agreements because we have said that we are placing the need for this in legislation. It's a commitment we made, we're honouring that commitment, and process is accelerating. I have to say, I don't think that process would have moved forward in the way it has had we not shown that clear intention. That is, in my view, a justification for what we are doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I have a brief supplementary from Claire Adamson? I presume it's on the specific
Yes,
point.
it is.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Cabinet Secretary, last week we took some evidence on the process of the consultation on the Code of Conduct, and there was a bit of concern raised about the lack of opportunity for student and staff representation and the lack of student and staff representation on the committee conducting this consultation. Do you share those concerns?
Yes, I do. I've shared them from the beginning of the process. I have on 2 separate occasions drawn to the attention of the chairs the need for more intensive consultation with students and staff. I have no lack of confidence, indeed I have great confidence in Robert Smith and in the other members, including the former Lord Advocate. But I do regret that at the beginning of the process, what was my advice to the chairs, which was to cast the net more widely, was not taken. Now, I'm sure that the work that's being done and the intensity of that work will produce a good result. But yes, I would have liked to have seen it. All the way in which I have operated and do operate is to try and ensure the widest involvement of staff and students, and I will go on doing so in all parts of this.
Neil Finlay.
Could I ask what the second bill will contain?
Well, I think that you would have to go back, Mr. Finlay, to von Pronzinski and go through the list of recommendations, and then you would see what the intention would be. This isn't a surprise. I have spoken about this on a number of occasions. Von Pronzinski is very clear in his recommendations and a whole range of recommendations, but some of them can be implemented without legislation, some of them can be implemented in this legislation, and the remaining ones will require further legislation to do so, which will take much longer to achieve. And, you know, the first one, list of recommendations, Annex A 2.2, the role of the Privy Council, is a difficult issue to resolve at this stage. Be much clearer after independence, I have to say, but it does require to be sorted. Number 2.3, the new statute, the underpinning legislation worked very well, and of course Ferdinand von Pronzinski's evidence and experience in Ireland has been great there, where it works extremely well. There are a range of things that will require us to move on, but we make a considerable step in that regard in this bill, and I think that the bill is therefore worth supporting even in those terms.
I must admit to being very surprised that you didn't get von Pronzinski's second paper that was presented to the committee. Can I read you a section from it, since you don't have it? He says, the controversy surrounding this provision in the bill in part be related to the fact that the Chair's Code has not yet been finalised or published. In these circumstances, it's not clear yet what particular principles of good governance might be enforced by legislation. He then goes on to say there are potentially 2 ways of dealing with this situation. One is to suggest that the timing of the provision is wrong and that it should be addressed, if at all, when legislation promised for higher education is published a year or 2 from now. I think that kind of sums up the questions that the committee is raising. And does it concern you that the architect of these reforms is posing that question at this late stage?
No, it doesn't concern me at all. I think he's right to pose the question. I think I am right to answer it in the way I'm answering it, which is to say that the code that is not referred to in the bill, there is an existing code. This is emphasising the need for good governance. It can exist with the code that exists, or it can be improved by the better code. That code will be coming to you, and that code will be discussed with you. I think in those circumstances you're taking evidence on it. I frankly don't see the problem.
Can I ask if the code will be voluntary?
Well, no, if you refer to the bill, the Scottish ministers may, under Section 9.2, impose a condition that the Council must, when making a payment to a higher education institution under Section 12.1, require the institution to comply with any principles of governance or management which appear to the Scottish minister to constitute good practice in relation to higher education institutions. All codes are advisory in a sense, because we'd expect them to do it, but there is a sanction in this, a financial sanction in this, and that is important in terms of good governance. Now, I've indicated what the principles of good governance are, and I think that that's very important. That provides a sanction which we felt was required, which I think the universities have seen as is something we wanted to do, and I'm comfortable with it.
Okay, thank you.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. Cabinet Secretary, we've had conflicting evidence on one particular point which relates to the whether college principals should be on the board. And some people have said that they're comfortable that they're not on the board, others have been indifferent, and others have been very strongly in favour. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think Russell Griggs has been quite clear about this and has been misquoted a bit on it. Russell thought it should be up to the board, and I'm of that opinion. I'm interested in the diverse opinion that exists. It appears to me, I think the EIS argued against it. The principals have argued strongly in favour of it. I think it should be up to individual boards, and that's essentially what the legislation suggests.
At the moment, it seems to be that the principals have the right to attend board meetings and to speak at board meetings, but they seem to be excluded from actually becoming a member of the board at this point.
No, I think the flexibility that the bill gives is the right flexibility in those circumstances, and I think because there is a diversity opinion on this. I think it would be wrong to say 100% no, 100% yes. Boards will make their decisions. They should be allowed to make their decisions. The general approach to this, I should say, to Mr. Beattie, in terms of composition boards, has been to free this up. The previous legislation was pretty prescriptive about who could and couldn't. I think the only disqualifications that are in this one is that MSPs, members of the House of Lords, and MPs and other elected people cannot chair regional boards. I think that's about it.
Okay, thank you. June McAlpine.
Yes, thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, the issue of university principals' salaries featured quite highly in our evidence session last week, and Robin Parker of the National Union of Students pointed to the fact that more than $4 million is spent each year on university principals' salaries. I wondered how you thought that the changes in governance that the bill introduces would address concerns about inflated salaries for principals.
Yeah, the Yvonne Prądzyński report has some recommendations in this, some of which you can, and I'm sure will be, in the code. Again, this is a section that was unanimously agreed by the committee, so it appears to have the support of the chairs of court. And he's interesting on this, and I would very much back what he says. First of all, he doesn't think that there should be continuing increases. Secondly, that any payments have to be transparent and the bonus culture should be abolished, essentially. Remuneration committees should include staff and student members. That, again, should be a transparent process. I have been on record in saying that I don't agree with a lot of the decisions that have been made. I think what Von Prądzyński has given us is a means by which we can make sure that those difficulties are not met in the future.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Neil Bibby.
Just to follow up the point about the proposed code of governance, Professor Von Prądzyński also, in his latest evidence, said the other possibility would be to allow this matter to be handled outside of a legislative framework. It could be addressed by the Cabinet Secretary, writing in his usual guidance to the Funding Council, asking the SFC to make it a condition of grant that principles of good governance are applied on a comply or explain basis. I was just wanted to ask you, Cabinet Secretary, what is your response to that?
Well, I think that Section 2, the first part of Section 2, addresses how we should move forward on this. It does allow the Funding Council to have that discretion across the code, but it does provide a sanction, and I think that's the right way to do so. If you have 19 institutions, which are all working on the code, if you have 19 institutions, there will always be flexibility within that, and there should be flexibility for 19 different institutions. But I have to say that I think that this section does what we need to do at this stage, and that's why I believe it's the right way to move ahead.
Okay, I think we've spent a reasonable amount of time on university governance. I want to move on, Cabinet Secretary, to Section 3 of the bill on widening access and begin the questioning with George Adam.
Morning, Cabinet Secretary. One of the things you said earlier on is it's an ambitious bill, and obviously widening access is one of the really ambitious parts of the bill in itself. And you mentioned the fact that it improves the life chances of our young people. Now, when we were listening to evidence, university principals were actually saying that there was nothing to see here, everything was okay, they were going to get there eventually with access, yet there was only something like a 1% improvement over a 10-year period. And the NUS also gave evidence that it would possibly be about 40 years before we got anywhere near where we needed to be. So would you not agree that that probably, Cabinet Secretary, is a reason why we should have legislation to try and move things forward?
When I started out in this position and the question of legislation on access was discussed, I was an agnostic. There had been a lot of voluntary codes and there was a lot of voluntary activity. It seemed to me, however, that the progress had been far too slow, and I don't think anybody around this table would disagree that the progress is satisfactory. And I became more and more convinced that we needed a legislative underpinning for this. And it is since that we have said that we want to do this that we've begun to see some real progress. And I think that speaks for itself. And in those circumstances, it is necessary to make sure that this exists. This is a carrot and a stick approach. That's what we've been trying to do. On the other side of this, you could say that the 1,700 additional places that we put in, there are 1,000 of those for articulation, 700 for wider access, are the cost of about £10 million, have been a substantial contribution, and I think we should continue down that route. But the legislation is important, and I am entirely in agreement with the NUS on this.
Some of the other discussions that we've had has been the potential for displacement has been mentioned at various points as well of students, and obviously retention of students is important because I've mentioned at length that University West of Scotland in Paisley obviously has quite a high proportion of people from a lower economic background. Now, how do you perceive the bill going on in the future with the idea of retention and ensuring against displacement?
Well, on retention, clearly one wants to make sure that those who get the opportunity and get into the system profit from that and come out at the end of that system with the degree that they sought to do, to finish the course. And we need to do everything we can to support that. Some of the work Glasgow University has done, for example, has been very positive in the preparation for university, helping young people to go to university and making sure that by the means of that preparation, they're more likely, actually more likely sometimes than other students to finish the course. And that's great. We need to do more of that. We'll look at it. In terms of displacement, adding places is an important part to make sure there are more opportunities. These 1,700 places have not been talked about enough. This is an additional part of it. But, in addition, we've been very, very careful to make sure that the number of places available for students coming up is retained and increased. And I think that's an important part of our offering. At the end of the day, decisions who to admit to university matter for universities. They have to be. There's no other way you should do this, and you shouldn't do it in any other way. But widening the context for this, making sure that the concept, for example, of rich attainment, which exists in other parts of education, is understood, will be something very positive, and I don't think it will have a negative effect at all.
Okay, thanks. Neil Finlay. What practical advantages will be gained in terms of widening access from legislating?
Well, I think what we've seen is an increased focus and also a sanction. Now, I hope that the sanctions don't have to be used, but there will be a sanction if any higher education institution is not prepared to treat this as seriously as it should be treated and to show evidence that they have done so. The widening access agreement, which sits alongside and within the concept of the outcome agreement but has distinct force, means that this becomes something that must be delivered. And everything we've had up until now has been something that has been aspirational but hasn't always been delivered.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to get at is what are the practical things that will happen as a result of the bill that will help widening access?
More young people who would otherwise not get to university will get there.
Let me try again. Within institutions, what are the practical things that they are going to do to ensure that more young people that more young people go, that more young people complete the course? What are the actual things that they will do?
You would have to go and look at the work of every individual university.
Could you give us some examples?
Well, I mean, I've talked about them a lot now. Happy to, for example, again, to refer to Glasgow University, their widening access programme, the way in which they have a scheme that works with individual schools, with pupils from schools who are less likely to go to university, which has intensive coaching for those young people over a number of years, which lays on summer schools for those young people and creates a guarantee that if if, for example, they miss one grade by a point or whatever, they'll still like to get in. So that means young people who might not have thought of going to university. Let me give you a specific example of somebody I talked to when I visited this last year, because it's still in my mind. A young person I spoke to who wanted to go into medicine came from a background in which there was no expectation that they would go to university or study medicine. The biggest challenge that they found as they went into this from fourth year onwards was the preparation of the personal statement and the preparation for the aptitude test. Both of those things are things they could be helped with by Glasgow University and by others who'd been through the same experience, because it's peer taught, amongst other things. That has been very successful indeed. I've actually heard, and I was on a platform with 2 students from St Andrews, which I know is not always associated with this activity, last year, and a student from, I think, Kirkcaldy High, who was the first member of her family ever to go to university, had been encouraged by St Andrews going out to the 5 schools as it does, and encouraging pupils from the 5 schools to go into a programme that the expectation of which is that they would go to that university. Now, I think there is good practice in every university. We need to encourage more of it, and those individual programmes are the things that will make the difference.
In terms of a desire to increase the numbers from low-income backgrounds, and of course I don't think there's anybody in this committee would move away from that principle. In fact, many of us have campaigned for it for years, but you must have is there a thought as to what the kind of numbers would be, what the aim is, the goal? Is there a percentage?
The aim is at least to meet the percentage of the population share that would come from those communities, the 20% from perhaps those socio-economic communities. But actually, I would go further than that, because, like you, I have campaigned for this for a long time. I believe this change is long overdue. And therefore, I don't think there should be any limit to that. I think what we should be doing is inspiring young people and older people to aim as high as they can. But the universities need to be focused on it. But it's also a wider responsibility. I do accept that point. And I know it's a point that's sometimes made in defence of some of the universities that have done less well. There is a wider point here. By debating and discussing it like this, by setting a legislative provision, we are also, I think, saying more widely, this is something we want to achieve and the whole of society needs to achieve it. Schools have a role to play in this, to work with young people so that they are aiming as high as they possibly can. Closing the attainment gap in Scotland is something that contributes to this, because we have to make sure that, in that phrase that I've quoted this committee before from Avis Glades, poverty is not destiny. And therefore we need to make sure that there's more work done on that. So all those things contribute to make a difference.
Mr. Smith.
Secretary, could I just be clear about that? Because we had a discussion about targets earlier today, and Mr Bathu, in my opinion, rightly said that he felt that these targets would be set, as we discussed, within an individual university. Given that you've just related that to the relevant size of population, do you mean that the aspiration for universities would be the intake from their particular region?
No. No, because universities are only partially regional. I mean, it is, you must have an idea that across the piece that is what we'll achieve. But no, there are individual targets. Mr Bathu is right. The bill indicates that. These are individual agreements with universities.
So can I just be absolutely clear, Cabinet Secretary, are you saying that the expectation is of the numbers from whichever measure we use for those of low income backgrounds will reflect the national Scottish deprivation level?
I would hope so, yes.
So there is a national target?
Well, I mean, I'm indicating that I can't imagine this as a point of difference. I'm indicating that that's that what people would want to see in higher education across Scotland. There are, and the bill makes it clear, that these are agreements with individual institutions. They will have different targets and different methods, and that's how it should be. I think there'd be something wrong if we were trying to do this in a one-size-fits-all way.
Cabinet Secretary, you said on the record earlier that the government would be in a position to enforce these changes through the outcome agreements that will be obviously within legislation. Are you saying that you are expecting a target to be set on an overall basis? No.
I'm saying that is a target we should all have in our mind. I am saying what the bill says, which is there will be individual agreements with each university, as indeed obviously Bathu has said, and that is the correct position. That's what the bill says. But I don't think anybody in this room would rest easy. I hope nobody in this room would rest easy until we have righted that wrong.
I'm sorry to be pedantic on this, but if you are going to ask universities to ensure that they have a specific target within their own recommendation, what happens if they are not meeting that? Are you going to take some national action about that?
Well, I mean, I'm sure, I'm absolutely certain you've read Section 3 of the bill, right? This is the section that relates to it. It makes, paragraph 2 says, the Scottish ministers may in particular impose a condition the Council, when making a payment to a higher education institution under Section 12.1, must require the institution to comply with a widening access agreement of such description as the Scottish ministers may specify. That is individually for institutions. It is institution by institution. I am saying that I think that in our minds we should not rest easy until we have righted the wrong that exists. I can't see anything inconsistent with that position.
Except that it says in that very clearly, what you've just read out, that it is at the behest of Scottish ministers.
Yes.
Thank you.
And that is a policy that we are following. The bill follows our policy intentions. That's not a surprise.
Okay, Neil Bibby.
Can I just ask you a bit more about the targets? You're saying there won't be a national target, it will be for individual universities to be negotiated with the Funding Council. Is there a minimum expectation you've got on universities in terms of widening access?
I think if you look at paragraph 3, Mr. Bibby, this pulls the point out. A widening access agreement is an agreement under which a higher education institution is to take actions specified by the Council for the purposes of enabling, encouraging or increasing participation in fundable higher education provided by the institution by persons belonging to socio-economic groups which are underrepresented in fundable higher education, either generally or in such education provided by the institution. I think that reflects the individual nature of the agreement and the national concern. And I think that is the right way to put it, and that's why it's put that way in the legislation.
In terms of the issue of retention that was mentioned earlier, retention is obviously a big issue in terms of ensuring participation of people from widening access backgrounds. Do you intend to support measures to make that, to improve that situation, to improve retention alongside the bill? For example, CELSIS have told the committee that success requires well-planned practical, emotional and financial support and the commitment of skilled staff, and universities may need to train staff in the difficulties facing some students.
Yes, and we already do.
Right, okay. Can I ask you, in terms of the costs associated with widening access, under, the bill team provided information on the cost to universities in relation to widening access, highlighting additional support to students through loans, etc., and lengthy discussions that have taken place with the sector. However, Universities Scotland have said the assumption that costs would be minimal had not been the subject of consultation with them. Do you, Minister, know if further discussions have been taking place between the bill team and Universities Scotland?
Yes, those discussions, there are discussions taking place all the time, but there's a very considerable sums of money going into widening access already. I mean, I've indicated to you, the Funding Council spends considerable sums on widening access.
20 million out of the 28 to 29 million that SFC spends on an annual basis for widening access goes directly to retention activities.
And the 1,700 extra places, which are really important, and that is a response to continue to move this forward, should be taken into account. So I think, the intention is there, the policy is there, we want to put the legislation in place and the resources there. I think that's an earnest of very good faith on this matter indeed.
And given this is a major piece of legislation, do you not feel those discussions should have happened earlier with the universities?
There are continued discussions. Discussions take place all the time. There are discussions about a range of things, and those discussions will continue. I don't think it would be right to say that there's any surprise. The surprise might be that we discuss so much, as we try and do, to have a partnership with all the parts of the sector.
And final question, if I may, Convener. In terms of giving young people from deprived backgrounds the opportunity to go to university, will you or are you considering giving more funding to areas that have high levels of deprivation to help with education provided at school level in those areas?
Well, we already try to make sure that the education system leads to equity, and we know there is more to do in that regard. I'm very happy to enter into discussion with you about what we're doing on that, to respond to questions upon that, and to look at what more we can do. Everybody knows, for example, that the highest performing education systems in the world, like the Finnish system, have the lowest level of division in that equity. In other words, the expectation of outcomes for pupils is in a much narrower band. And Scotland, like many countries, because the rest of the UK has this problem too, that band is still too wide. It is narrowing but too wide. So I wouldn't dispute for a moment that more is to be done, but I think you and I would be in agreement that that should be an educational priority across the board.
Okay, I want to move on now to section 4 of the bill on the fee cap, Cabinet Secretary, if you don't mind, and we'll start with Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. Cabinet Secretary, the NUS and one or two others have raised a specific problem in connection with the tuition fees cap. Really, it rotates around the fact that a Scottish degree course is usually a year longer than an English one. And if we take, for example, that, let's say the fees are £9,000 a year, the fee in England would be 27,000 and the fee in Scotland would be 36,000. Now, clearly, I know the NUS was arguing there should be a price for a degree as opposed to the length of time it takes it. What's your view on that?
I don't want a price for a degree. I mean, we are in this difficult position because of decisions that have been made elsewhere. I regard what is taking place as unfortunately a necessary evil because of the decisions that have been made elsewhere. And if the UK government would like to pay for their students, I'd be very happy that they did that. But they don't want to do so. So in those circumstances, what I'm trying to do is simply to make sure that the system in Scotland is as fair as it can be. But it is a decision for the universities. It's right that it's a decision for the universities. There's a number of ways it can be ameliorated. Quite often, students to south of the border can go in for direct entry to second year, particularly if they have a particular range of qualifications. Secondly, some universities discount that and only charge 3 years. But when we get into that, I do think that's not where we want to be. What we want to be is to set as fair a situation as we can. Regrettably, we're in this position. I don't believe in the monetarisation of higher education. So I came to a voluntary agreement with the principals. There was a very clear understanding that we would put that voluntary agreement into legislation at the first available opportunity, and that is what we're doing.
It's probably worth noting that there's no indication of a drop-off of students from south of the border because of this differential.
Well, I think it's highly undesirable, and I think when you look at the situation of some of students from Northern Ireland, for example, where there's been traditional flow, it's continuing. I think it's immensely regrettable that this decision was made, but it's not a decision that I made.
Another thing I'm looking at is University Scotland's evidence to us, which they expressed concern about what they thought was an anomaly in the bill, which could lead to Welsh domiciled students being charged at a maximum fee of £3,465, which was apparently related to the level at the Welsh Assembly.
They've raised this with us. We do not believe that that anomaly exists. Obviously, we'll have further discussions, but my advice is that it does not exist. And that's, so I have to say I don't believe that exists.
Okay, thank you. Neil Bibby.
Have you, Cabinet Secretary, considered a Scottish Office of Fair Access, similar to that in England, which has been raised by a number of witnesses, to regulate information available to students on bursaries and regulate the arrangements in place by university?
I've heard the suggestion from the NUS. I think we've got to remember that the Office of Fair Access exists south of the border really as a financially redistributive mechanism for a system that I think is wrong. It is an office essentially to try and undo some of the unjustness of the policy that's being operated south of the border. I think that in Scotland the universities have been and are being very sensitive to this issue. Their bursary provision for rest of UK students has increased very substantially, and I see no reason to interfere in that because I think that they are very conscious. They have also, made public criticism of what the situation is south of the border.
Just a question from myself, Cabinet Secretary, if you don't mind. The Chair's evidence to the committee was that a fee cap was unnecessary, and that since no institution would be wishing to set fees higher than the maximum level currently applicable in England. I wonder, I presume you read that evidence, and I just wondered what your view was on their particular take on it, that the cap was not necessary.
Well, it goes absolutely contrary to the agreement that I had with the university principals, which I think, Tim O'Shea was quite clear about it when he gave evidence. There was an agreement that this was something that needed to be in statute. We needed to declare very clearly what we thought should take place. But until we could do so, there would be a voluntary agreement. I have no criticism of the principals at all. They've done that. But there was always an agreement this should be set in statute, and it needs to be set in statute, just in case anybody thought that there was another way of doing this, because we don't, and I think this speaks for, well, not for all of Scotland, but it certainly speaks for most of Scotland. We don't think this is the right way to do higher education, and we don't want it to spread.
Okay, thank you. I want to move on now to the issue of college regionalisation in the bill and begin the questioning with Neil Finlay.
Yeah, well, obviously going through this, we've had a number of people before the committee, and I would like to just give you a wee selection, a wee flavour of some of the quotes that they have said. On the regional strategic bodies, Susan Walsh, Cardonald College, she says, clarity is still required on how the assigned college boards will work with the regional strategic boards. If the question about who is responsible was answered, it would help us understand what people want. Scotland's colleges say there does not appear to be any precedent for this model. Edinburgh College, we have concerns over the proposed structure of Regional College Board of Management, in particular the intention to remove the legal requirement for a principal to be a board member. On the lines of accountability and the psychology, there is a risk of divided loyalties if a principal of an assigned college is appointed and their paying conditions determined by a body that is not their employer. There will clearly be tension in the relationship in a two-tier system, John Henderson. It goes on and on. Post-16 bill could be improved to provide greater clarity. Susan Walsh. Mandy Exley says we're concerned about accountability and autonomy. It just simply goes on and on and on. Are you concerned about so many of the witnesses coming forward raising the issue about the complexity that we now have within the college governance, and financing?
Well, I would want to, but I'm not going to go through the same set of evidence and point out all the positive things that were said, and I think that there were many positive things to have said. If there is a need to amend the bill, and Mr Finlay brings forward amendments that clarify any provision, then of course we'll look at them very seriously. But I'm clear in my own mind about what the structure is and how it should operate. And I think it's quite a simple structure, to tell you the truth. It is a structure that has a regional component wherever you are in Scotland. There is one set of special circumstances, which is in the University of the Highlands and Islands. I'd be very happy to talk about how that came about, because I don't think you've had full evidence on that. And there's some very interesting information about what the colleges themselves have sought. Then there is a regional model that operates as a single regional college with two exceptions. There aren't three exceptions now, there are two exceptions. And those are both multiple college areas. I think the direction of travel is towards single colleges, but that direction will take as long as it takes. In those circumstances, it seems quite clear to me. Now, there are issues within that Mr Beattie raised the issue of principals on the boards, which we can debate, and we should debate. The question of the appointment of the principal by the regional structure is one I think we should debate. I think there are arguments on both sides, and that's the purpose of a stage 2 of a bill, where we take the general principles and then we make sure that any changes that need to be made about how those are expressed are expressed. But I read the evidence very clearly. I spent a lot of time in colleges speaking to staff and to students and to college principals and to college boards. And I was very struck by something that Paul Sheraton said, the principal of Banff and Buchan. His biggest concern, I think he was asked a question specifically about his biggest concern. And his biggest concern was the question of funding cuts and when those would come to an end and whether there would be a straightforward level playing field from now on. That was just before the budget. We have addressed that concern, and I'm very glad at the views, for example, of Scotland's colleges, who are very, very pleased at having that addressed. You quoted them, I'll quote them here. In those circumstances, I think we have now a workable situation, which of course we can improve, and I welcome thoughts for improvement.
Some of the issues that there remains real problems with, I would say, governance and the complexity of it. We've got financial issues, and the Finance Committee have 7 main points that they've raised. We've got the issue of ministerial powers versus autonomy, HR issues, appointment of principals, data sharing concerns that we heard about last week. We've got issues around, there's been no mention about collective bargaining of conditions, complexity of funding, and charitable status and local access. All of those things are still very, very unclear.
No, you could ask a question about all of this.
Excuse me, I'm not
Please
finished. I'm not finished yet. In fact, if I could summarise it, I think the quote by the EIS, who incidentally are very supportive of regionalisation, the principle of regionalisation, but their quote, I think, sums it up quite well. They say, if the government's aim is to create a nationally incoherent FE sector structure with a myriad of different separate regulations for each, then this bill is it. If one of the main supporters of the principle is saying that, this bill is in trouble.
No, I entirely disagree. The EIS FILA have claimed to be in support of the bill, but I don't think yet they have actually said anything that helps us to improve the bill. If they want to come and do that, I'll be very welcome to have that debate. Each of those points are points which, if you ask questions about, this committee asks questions about, I will address. On charitable status, for example, I'm quite sure our legal advisor will be prepared to say precisely what the situation is there, and there's no threat to charitable status. Each of those things are legitimate points to discuss. I welcome that discussion. But the fact they are raised does not necessarily make them totally true. And if we can address them, if there are real concerns and we address them, we can amend, you can amend, you have the right to do so, if you think things need changed. That's the process we're in.
Cabinet Secretary, can I ask, why would you not wait until the coming bill comes forward and take longer in an attempt to get this right?
Which coming bill?
Well, on higher education, there's a higher education bill. Why couldn't we bring the two together in a forthcoming bill that gets all of this correct?
We've never considered pausing on the issue of regionalisation because it requires to be completed in order to provide a better service to learners, and that's what we're doing.
But it's happening now without legislation.
Well, what is happening is the structures are being put in place which require legislation to complete. Otherwise, we could not complete this process. So it would be going off at half cock if we stop now. We have to finish the job, and the job is quite clear. And all the points you've raised are legitimate points, and we are happy to address all of those points. And where we've mentioned the one on principles, we can address that, we can resolve it. The question of charitable status is quite clear in my view. All the others will address, and where there are genuine concerns, and I read that evidence, we will also address those. I spend a lot of time talking to staff, students, principals, college boards, college chairs, and we are working our way through these issues very constructively indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Seeing as the issue of charitable status has come up, Cabinet Secretary, can I ask Ailsa, seeing as you're here, as Senior Principal Legal Officer, to just give us your view on the issue of charitable status?
Our view is that the bill doesn't affect the charitable status of the colleges, that nothing in the bill has been done which would jeopardise that. The charities, the colleges which are already charities, should continue to be able to meet the charity tests set down in the Charities Act.
Why do you think then there has been concern raised about this, if it's so clear?
I mean, I suppose we're not entirely clear why the concerns have been raised, because I mean, there are provisions in the bill about say requiring transfers of property, and there are specific provisions that if a transfer is required, then it can only be to a body which is for purposes of advancement of education, and that is a charitable purpose. So that that safeguards the body and allows it to continue to meet the charity test.
We've tried, wherever concerns have been raised, to answer those clearly and openly, as as Ailsa's just done there. I will go on doing that. I mean, this is a complex process, but it's a process which we're trying to make as clear as possible, and the legislation makes clear how things will work. But any of the issues raised by Mr. Finlay, we're happy to address.
Okay, sorry, Liz, was it direct on?
Yes, it's on charitable status,
actually.
Okay. I accept what you're saying about the majority of colleges, but in the case of perhaps Glasgow, Lanarkshire, etc., are you absolutely confident that if there was any transfer of assets and the government was involved in that process, that charitable status would be maintained? Because I understand that's the reason why John Henderson has actually written to Oscar to ask for that guarantee. Are you absolutely confident in these cases?
Before his answer, I just want to be clear what that question means. I'm not aware of any government involvement in the process of transferring assets from anybody to anybody. So it is a very hypothetical question. I mean, I'm not trying to be difficult about this, but if there's a specific issue which I have not seen about specific movement of assets, then I'm happy to look at it. But there is no involvement by government, as far as I'm aware, of any transfer of assets.
John Henderson said very clearly that the reason that he had written to Oscar was to seek clarification and hopefully the confidence that there is no threat to charitable status, given that I think he put on record something in the region of £50 million per annum is the value of that. But obviously, because of the different structures that will apply when it comes to Glasgow and to Lanarkshire, there is more scope because of the nature of that for government involvement. And as you know, when it comes to charity legislation, there is the issue at the beginning of that legislation. That
there is
makes
no difference in government involvement. I mean, I have to say, I think we would need to bottom this out, because we are at second hand quoting John Henderson. There is no government involvement of that nature. There would be no question of it, right? So I don't believe the question would arise. I think the legal answer is clear. But in order to be helpful to the member convener, I am happy to address this with John Henderson and to come back to the member in the committee with a response to it. But I think we need to know specifically what his point is. I have not seen it.
Well, I think there are others. I don't think it's just John Henderson, Cabinet Secretary. I think there are others who are looking at the situation where obviously in the assigned colleges situation, if the government is responsible for oversight of the board, both in terms of appointment and board members, then there is increasing government involvement, and that is something that could, I'm not saying it will, impinge on charitable
I'm sorry, I'm happy to do so because I want to be helpful, but there is no increasing government involvement in that way. The bill has been designed in that way, and there is no threat to charitable status. That's a legal petition.
The charitable status issue, I mean, you made your view clear, but just for clarity's sake, Mr Henderson said, when oversight is changed between a funding body, be it the government or a funding council and a charity, there is a risk that the independence of the charitable trustees will be affected, and Oscar will take the view that that would move it out of the charitable status camp. That's Mr Henderson's quote.
I think there is perhaps a slight confusion of two issues in the sense of the duties of the charitable trustees and the charitable status of the organisation. I think that's perhaps what is being raised here. I think that's perhaps...
If there's any further clarification that you can provide, I would be grateful.
I would want to make sure there's an understanding of what Ailsa has said. We are confident there is no threat to charitable status. And it's good to address it. We'll address the detail if Mr Henderson has an issue which we are unaware of.
Okay, thank you. Joan McAlpine.
Yes, thanks very much, Convener. Yes, last week the committee took oral evidence from Ian Mackay, the regional lead in Edinburgh, and I was struck by his experience that he described of being a senior official in the EIS at the time of the reorganisation of the further education sector under the Conservative government in the early 90s, and he described how you had a regional model, and the reorganisation had resulted in what he termed an atomisation of the system, and he concluded by saying, pulling us back into regions and giving us a better opportunity for scale and strategic advance will give what has tended to be the Cinderella sector of further education a better chance of the races. In a sense, reflecting on what he said, he seemed to be talking about a sort of back to the future principle of this bill, and I wondered what your views were on that.
Well, I think Ian, who has a lot of experience in this sector, he did teach in further education, then he was worked in further education and then was a trade union official and is now chairing the Edinburgh Board, speaks a lot of sense. I was also struck by the evidence from his principal, from Andy Exley, about the economies and advantages of scale that she was seeing. So I think that he is reflecting, the need for the regional focus, which I think is absolutely clear and strong, and I think it's been welcomed by everybody, and also the fact that we are, by so doing, we're creating bodies of scale. I was also struck by the way in which university principals are addressing the issue of involvement with the college sector. I think we're seeing a real joining up here because we have colleges of scale. And I mean, somebody hasn't given evidence to you, but I had a very interesting conversation with her some weeks ago about this, Linda Mackay, the principal of Forth Valley College, talking about the way in which, and she had been through an earlier set of mergers, the way in which they were now operating as a college of scale and operating as part of an educational infrastructure within central Scotland was very impressive indeed. So I think it is right to draw attention to this wider view, which is also locally based, you know, and it's based on the campuses and is serving the locality, but takes the wider view and creates in Scotland these bodies of scale. I think that's positive. I think we're seeing the benefits, and indeed I think Mandy particularly was indicating how those benefits are already flowing through in Edinburgh. And in, you know, to be fair, the City of Glasgow College would also indicate, after its experience of merger, that it has seen that being effective as well.
Okay, thank you very much. There have been issues raised, of course, about the costs of the regionalisation process, but I understand that colleges have £200 million of reserves. Can you explain why the structure has resulted in that happening at a time when capital expansion has been so unprecedented in the further education sector?
The situation of reserves is complex and touchy sometimes with colleagues. I read the evidence of the principals and Mandy's evidence particularly about how this was working capital that she had, and she felt she needed that working capital. Indeed, I've heard it, you know, from other college principals. And also there is a fairness to say that some reserves relate to capital expansion plans. You know, colleges have from time to time been able to fund part of their capital expansion from reserves. And if you look, for example, at the situation of Aberdeen College, which has a project underway to refurbish the building there in Aberdeen, that money is almost entirely coming from college reserves, and a lot of those reserves have been built up by their trading subsidiary. So there is, you know, there's obviously some quite legitimate reasons for that. I think there are also some concerns that sometimes colleges have established reserves out of public funding, and I think we would want to make sure that that money is ploughed back into the system. And Russell Griggs had a series of recommendations which have been under consideration. But I think we are seeing a growing willingness by the college sector to invest their reserves in the process of change, and I would encourage them to do so.
And the issue of reserves, I mean, I understand from the evidence that we've received that, you know, some colleges can build up reserves more easily than others because they're able to, you know, earn quite a bit of money from different courses, whereas colleges operating solely with challenged, disadvantaged students might find it more difficult. Will the move to regionalisation help, you know, establish a more level playing field in that respect?
I hope so, and I hope that the discussion that we're having about reserves, and have had for some time about reserves, will encourage colleges to think about this issue more closely. There's no point sitting on, I mean, not all these reserves are cash reserves, but there's no point sitting on a pile of cash, you know, in a sector where we need to spend money in order to encourage educational activity. So I would hope that they will recognise that. Within the confines of working capital, within the confines of preparing for capital investment, all those things are complex. But certainly I don't think that any increase in reserves would be justified, and I think there's a very strong justification in using reserves for the process of change. And of course, you know, in terms of the transition funding that we've been able to put up for change in the college sector, there has been a strong pressure for colleges to participate by putting forward money themselves if they have reserves.
Thank you very much.
Neil Bibby.
Neil Finlay raised a number of the concerns earlier. I was just going to ask about the relationship between assigned colleges and regional strategic bodies. There are concerns about assigned colleges being treated equally, maintaining their autonomy and not being overlooked by the regional strategic bodies. How are you going to ensure that these concerns are addressed?
Well, the assigned colleges clearly will be working within a structure which will be funded by the SFC. It will be subject to outcome agreement. The outcome agreement is absolutely clear in my mind that that is the vehicle by which delivery is made. I think it's likely to work very well indeed within the structure that we have. The regional strategic body will be key, but then we know that because regionalism is key, and I can't see a problem.
There's concerns as well about regional strategic bodies being controlling rather than enabling from assigned colleges. How will you ensure that that's,
I think the legislation is quite clear what the functions of the regional strategic body are. I would expect them to exercise those functions within the law. I would expect, working together and goodwill to underpin that. I don't anticipate that problem will arise.
Okay, and we touched on the Griggs Review recommendation on the Scottish Government's Further Education Strategic Forum earlier. Could you confirm again what the status is of that?
I've given the responsibility to the regional leads to bring forward proposals. We had a very good discussion last week in the regional leads meeting. I meet the regional leads about every 6 weeks about how we're taking that forward. I anticipate the regional the Further Education Forum will meet before the summer recess.
Can I ask, in terms of if the strategic forum is to drive forward the college sector in the future, do you not think it should have been established before now and been involved before this bill and before this process?
No, I think it's a sensible suggestion from Russell that we should do this. We're doing it. I think it will have its effect. It will work with the new structure as it goes into place.
But you don't think it should have happened? It should be driving this bill, this agenda, and
no, I don't. I think that it's quite clear what its function is. Russell defines that function. That function operates after the process of regionalisation is essentially established by law.
Okay. Neil Finlay.
Can I ask about colleges are having to go down the regional model? Why are universities not?
Well, they're very different bodies. They operate in different ways. They have different responsibilities. We have 19 higher education institutions in Scotland. We have presently 41 colleges in Scotland. It seems to me that your answer is there.
But if the principle's right, then why would you not apply it to both?
Well, they're entirely different organisations operating in different ways, and there are only 19 of them. At the end of this process, we'll have 13 regional structures. That seems to be about right. I also made a commitment that I would not force anybody, college or university, into merger, and you wouldn't expect me to break that.
Yeah, that's fine.
George Adam.
Yes, thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, we've spoke about half an hour on regionalisation of colleges, and we haven't actually spoke about the educational attainment that it offers for young people. I know you're perfectly aware that outside these doors there's a real world out there, and in my own college, I know for a fact you visited recently, and they're quite keen at the challenges and everything that it offers, the regionalisation. So would you agree with me that the positive ambitions for college regionalisation is that they're job focus, local focus in the locale, and focused on what our young people can achieve, like everything else in the higher education side of the bill?
Absolutely. I mean, the opportunities that regionalisation offers are very great, but they're not just regional. They enhance the ability of colleges to deliver locally. They make sure that there is a broader provision within the area. I visit colleges regularly. I make a point of meeting staff, students, management, board, everybody I can meet, and I can see lots of opportunities arising. And I go back to this colleges of scale issue. What the colleges are able to do is extremely important for the widest range of people, and that's what we want to make sure happens. And it's not just 16 to 19-year-olds. It's colleges have an older clientele, very, very strong older clientele. It is making sure that they are working with as wide a community as possible and focused on employability. And the commission that Ian Wood is going to chair is looking at this in a different way and looking at the young workforce and how they can take things forward. And I think the combination of the reform that we've gone through, the work that Ian Wood is doing with his colleagues, is going to be very powerful indeed. And the work that Angela Constance has done, in her first year in office, has been tremendous in pushing this issue forward, particularly the youth employment issues and opportunities for all. These are all significant things that are taking place, and they are joined.
Part of that is obviously things have moved on while the bill's been we're discussing the bill. £61 million over 2 years, as you've already said, has been made available. Now, would you agree that you mentioned earlier on that you're in discussion constantly with all the partner organisations? Obviously, on the 6th of February, when it was announced, John Henderson, Chief Executive of Colleges Scotland, says today's budget announcement is warmly welcomed by Colleges Scotland and our members. This additional funding will help to give colleges stability over the next 2 years while they work to successfully complete the reform process. As the sector's representative, we have highlighted its economic importance to the Scottish Government, and we are pleased that its value has been recognised by ministers. Is this not another example of actually working with the partner organisations?
I think I'm very pleased at John Henderson's reaction. I've had it across the college sector. I've never wanted to have perpetual revolution. I wanted to make sure that we got to the stage where the reforms, were able to bed in a secure footing, and my aim was to do that. And in the financial circumstances, it has been very hard indeed. But I am very pleased that we now have a clarity going forward that when we get to the 522 in 13-14, that's the figure going forward. And planning, and work can be based upon that. And in addition, the transitions are taking place, for example, to the new funding model, which is well underway, will be things that will be positive for the sector. But not just for the sector, for every individual student, that security exists. This has been a difficult process, but it's a process that needed to take place to enhance the employment prospects of young people in Scotland and to enhance the vital services that colleges deliver across the board, because more than 20% of higher education is delivered in colleges. And this is what we've been able to achieve. And this is is, in a sense, the legislation then puts that finally into place.
I'm very aware of time. There's a number of areas we still want to cover, so I'd be grateful if members would ask brief questions, and if there were brief answers as well, Cabinet Secretary, that would be very helpful. Can I move on to review of fundable further and higher education with Joan McAlpine?
Yes, I asked earlier when Mr Berthaud spoke to us about the review of fundable further and higher education and the concerns that university principals had raised about the possible impact of the reviews on their institution's ability to determine course provision. I wondered what your view was on those concerns that the principals expressed.
I do not believe there is any impact on course provision whatsoever. And indeed, I'm somewhat surprised by some of the debate surrounding this, because it does seem to me that what we are suggesting here is a very sensible and proportionate approach to ensuring that we have a clear view of what essentially further and higher education contributes to Scotland. And let me explain that. I'm sorry if I may have a moment to explain it, because I think it's important. You could look at some of the spats that have existed about changes in higher and further education, which have been highly individualised. I mean, you could look at, for example, the arguments that took place about Abertay and Dundee and the difficulties that caused. You could look at some of the arguments that have taken place about provision of colleges. And you said, wouldn't it be better if we took a systematic and structured view of this from time to time for a sector that we spend further in higher education together, taking SDS aside, it's about £1.6 billion. Beyond that, a year. Now, we need to look at that from time to time. The mechanism to look at it should be the Funding Council, though clearly it would want to draw in additional help from the sector as well. A clear set of criteria that said, why should we do this? Well, that's the time to do it. A clear set of criteria about what is being looked at, and then a set of recommendations for public debate and discussion, not just for the Minister, but for public debate and discussion and for scrutiny by the Parliament, strikes me as eminently reasonable. Now, I'm happy to debate and discuss it, and if there are ways in which it is expressed that can be clearer, or perhaps meet the anxiety of the universities, I'm happy to look at that. But it does seem to me something that is improving how we take an overview of education in Scotland, and that's surely to be welcomed.
Mr Berthaud raised an interesting example from the past of when the Scottish Funding Council intervened as a result of concerns in terms of modern languages provision in Scotland. And he seemed to be saying that the Scottish Funding Council already had the ability to review when necessary. Is it the case that the bill perhaps is a way of tying different forms of ability to review together rather than doing anything radically new?
Well, I think it adds something to what already exists. The Slavonic languages issue, which is a great part of what I think Mark was referring to, was a very interesting one, and it's still going on. Now, it's not about an individual university delivering or not delivering. It is a wider question for the whole of Scottish society as the people who fund higher education about what provision they would expect to find somewhere in Scotland. There are some things which are not available in Scotland at the present moment and perhaps should be available. So I think if you did that within a wider context from time to time, you don't want to do it every 10 minutes, but if you did it from time to time, you would probably be able to get a more rational view of what should be provided. And that, I hope, might avoid the type of very passionate debate about Slavonic languages, or people marching in the streets because something wasn't being provided in one place and they felt it should be. So I think this is a positive thing to do, and I think it's got real potential to help us to decide how we invest in further and higher education in Scotland rather than do anything else. Now, as I say, if there are things in it that need changed, if there's words in it that need to be clearer, we can do that, and I'm happy to listen to that. But it does seem to be a reaction against what I think is a logical proposal and a helpful proposal.
Right. I should have corrected myself and said Slavonic languages, so thanks for doing that, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. Moving on to the issue of data sharing, which has caused us some concern, Cabinet Secretary. I'm sure you're aware of some of the discussions, but I want to begin with Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. The evidence that we heard last week seemed to have quite a confusing understanding of what the data sharing would be for and what would actually be delivered from it. And I just wondered if you could maybe clarify what are the objectives of the data sharing?
I have to say that they're simple, and I share your concern, having read the evidence. I want to be very simple about this. This is a modest enabling provision that allows something to happen. And what it particularly allows is the quality of data to improve. What it's about is not just giving the data or accessing the data, it's making sure the data is of a sufficient quality to be meaningful. And there have been problems about that. I mean, I think this committee has heard me say in the past, I think the quality of that data was not high enough. It is not about some all-singing, all-dancing, massive new initiative. My concern, the reason this is in the bill, is my concern, I think, has arisen after discussions with a whole range of people, is that the quality of data coming through to allow us to understand what is happening in this sector has been patchy, if I may put it that way, and we need to improve it. But, that is what I think the bill is about. The bill is carefully drafted and narrowly drafted in that regard, and I wouldn't want to see any expansion of that drafting, and that is what I would wish to see take place.
Can I ask Cabinet Secretary about the role of Skills Development Scotland in intervening post-data sharing being in place? Do you see an increased role for Skills Development Scotland in actually intervening when they see a problem?
Well, I think what they need to, somebody needs to be able to flag up the issue. I followed the exchange between the convener and Skills Development Scotland with interest, and I think there is an issue. How would you know that this was taking place? But a careful reading of data, and somebody who's experienced in reading data, would probably lead you to some conclusions when you see that data. We need to establish somewhere those people. They do exist in Skills Development Scotland. That's what many people in Skills Development Scotland do. So I think they've got a role, but it's a collaborative role. And it's not an overarching role. It's a collaborative role, and I'd expect them to fulfil it, but in the terms that I have outlined.
Thank you.
Joan McAlpine.
Yes, just a supplementary on that. The Open University has highlighted its concerns about the quality of the data in higher educational statistics, and in particular they're keen to get more data on their student body, so part-time students and more mature students. Now, as I understand it, the bill doesn't really address those concerns, and I wondered whether those concerns were going to be addressed at some point in the future.
Well, it is an issue for the Open University, though probably not for any other part of higher education. I'm not unsympathetic to it. If there is a proposal that would come forward that would help with that, I'm not unsympathetic. But what we've got here is specifically addressed to a particular issue that we know exists and a means of solving it. I would want to know that any suggestions that the Open University had, we could address that and solve it in a clear and rational and not too elaborate manner. The other difficulty that probably arises at the Open University is if we were to do it in Scotland, what provision would exist elsewhere in these islands? I'm not sure about that. But if anybody wants to bring that forward or ask specifically about it, we can consider it.
Okay, thank you.
Cabinet Secretary, I'm pleased with the response you've made. I mean, I have to say that last week I was less than convinced by the responses we received from SDS witnesses. I thought there was a lack of clarity, and I had to say, I think I said last week, it seemed to be being rather oversold as to what was actually being provided. But just for confirmation, what you are telling us is this is a rather simple data sharing exercise with a data hub, if that's the correct title, being established by SDS, who would gather data that already exists, and nothing more than that.
No, this is about identifying and supporting. It is not about creating data empires, and it won't be. and it's very clear that what we're talking about is access and quality, and that's what we want to do. And I always think, in these circumstances, it's very important to go back to the bill. I think the bill is entirely clear about that. It's not over-ambitious. And somebody raised the question of the financial memorandum. The financial memorandum is modest in this regard because what is being talked about is modest in this regard. And we need to keep that in the forefront of our minds. And I'm quite sure, if I may put it this way, I'm sure Skills Development Scotland will be reading the transcript of this and will understand your view and my view about what it is.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. I want to move on now to the financial memorandum, and particularly the evidence of the Finance Committee. And begin with Liz Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, just on the point of obviously the paper that was given to us by the Finance Committee, just a few issues. You've obviously made available the 1,700 additional places, and therefore that's properly funded, etc. If that was to be continued beyond this budgetary period, in the sense that you're providing more places for universities, could I just be clear about the funding mechanism for that?
Yeah, well, it would obviously be subject to the spending review, but it is within the existing expenditure figures which carry forward. So we would anticipate them carrying them forward.
Right. The issue which you referred to yourself about displacement is obviously only applicable if there weren't additional places. And as I say, within this spending review, these places are available, therefore that problem doesn't arise. I think there is a question about the bill going forward in terms of how much money would be available for widening access, given that there isn't any additional money in the financial memorandum. Is that a genuine concern for the universities?
No. Well, if it is a concern, it's a concern that everybody across Scotland would share, because in every part of life, because we don't know what will happen south of the border. And as long as we are still tied into that system, we will not be able to say what will happen south of the border on the spending review. That having been said, I think it's fair to say that the member and I have a different view of the affordability of higher education. We're not going to resolve it here. Certainly my view is that that would continue to be funded in the way that met our policy objectives, and I accept the point that you would want to and would need to continue with at least the same number of places, and would presumably want to increase them.
Thank you for that answer. And, our political views aside, obviously there is a genuine concern if there is not any additional money within the financial memorandum. Yet you've made very specific this morning and within the bill the desire to widen access quite considerably. And a paper was given to the Finance Committee, albeit with slightly out-of-date figures in it, about the additional cost that students from poorer backgrounds do actually impose on the universities by definition of the fact they need more student support, etc. There is a concern about this, Cabinet Secretary, in terms of extending that into the future.
Yes, I have to say it wasn't slightly out of date. It was 2002 England only.
No, I'm
data,
acknowledging it was out of date,
but
there is a concern that these students do cost more.
Well, I think that we have shown our intentions in what we're spending presently through the Funding Council in the additional places, and we will continue to go on funding that in the way to achieve our policy objectives. We may disagree on the fine-tuning of it, but I think we can probably agree that that is our intention and we wish to do so.
So could you just confirm then that that additional spending would come from the public purse?
Well, I think you're asking me to do something I can't do, which is to say what would be in the spending review. But what I can say is the policy intention is clear, and the policy intention will be followed through by the government. I mean, I can't go any further than that, but that should be enough.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Neil Bibby.
Cabinet Secretary, can you confirm what the set-up costs for the University of Highlands and Islands become the regional strategic body for in that area will be, and why this was not included in the financial memorandum?
Can I ask Michael Cross to answer that?
May I answer, Mr. Bibby? The fact is that we're still discussing through the Funding Council with the University of the Highlands Islands what the right level of establishment, what the right level of set-up costs should be, and we don't know the answer to those discussions yet.
And when would you expect to know the answer?
I think it's not necessarily imminent, but within a matter of weeks.
Okay. The financial memorandum also states that the costs for the 3 regional boards, but I understand it's now going to be 2, for 2014-15, it's estimated to be up to 560,000 each, given an annual total of £1.68 million, being the aggregate total. Now, following the Aberdeenshire not being involved in that, or going to be 2 regional strategic bodies rather than 3, how is the, I take it the amount has changed or will change in the financial memorandum?
Yeah, if I may, the cost falls by a third.
Right, okay, that's fine. I just wanted to confirm that. Obviously, the Scottish Government has said that regionalisation will bring around savings of, I think it's £50 million in the process. Just in terms of the financial memorandum, given that we're hearing that there'll be staffing costs, accommodation costs, licence fees, audit fees, plus payments to chairs and possibly members of regional boards and regional strategic boards, have you revisited the estimate of £560,000 for each regional strategic board?
No, we worked that up in liaison with Scotland's colleges, now Colleges Scotland, and we took the advice, as I've explained to the committee previously, of a senior HR professional from the sector who works within my division, and that led us to those figures.
Can I ask, has anything been spent to date on the setting up of the regional strategic boards, and how much has been spent?
No, there's some modest support in place at the moment from the Scottish Funding Council to the regional leads, but as yet we've not constructed regional strategic bodies of any sort.
And what is that modest support?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. And in terms of ongoing costs for the regional strategic bodies, it's been mentioned £110,000. Do you feel that is somewhat light? And can you tell us what that £110,000 comprises of?
Sorry, I can't find the piece of paper. Perhaps, Gavin, you could continue to look for it. I mean, I have a feeling we wrote, convener, to the committee with the disaggregating the costs that we'd set out in the financial memorandum on college regionalisation.
No, I don't think you wrote to us. Perhaps you wrote to the Finance Committee.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Well, if we can provide you with the information we provided the Finance Committee, that would be the best thing to do.
Very helpful, but if Mr Cross is able to answer the question here, that would be also helpful.
I am. I'm grateful to Gavin for finding the figure for me. Well, we're confident that the £110,000 figure remains a reasonable one. We don't think it is light. It comprises computing equipment, consumables, travel expenses for board members, travel expenses for officials, accommodation costs, rent, staff-related costs, non-salary costs, the recruitment costs of board members, and other professional and audit services.
And can I ask, in terms of a point has been raised about the process of if a regional board was to be wound up, what would happen and whether its liabilities and assets would transfer to a merged or associated college. Is there a view on that?
Can you pick that up, please?
Yeah, there would be a transfer to, I think, probably to, if it were wound up because there was a regional college, then it would be likely to be a transfer to a regional college that was formed.
I think in terms of winding up, that would occur, you know, the most likely provision would be because they were moving to a single regional college, which would be obviously a transfer. If there was a disaggregation into, well, I can't imagine the bill wouldn't permit that, so.
Okay.
Thank you. Neil Finlay.
Just 2 final points. Last year we saw, shall we say, a slight disagreement between yourself and the chair of a college, and at the time you expressed the view that had you the powers to remove that person, you would have. Within this bill, there's quite a number of further powers that you will gain. What do you say to the charge that people are levelling that this is a centralising bill to give more powers to ministers?
I say that that's not true. That is not what is taking place. There are a range of circumstances in which the powers of mismanagement would apply, and let me just quote them. If it appears the Scottish Ministers at the Board of Management of any College of Further Education, 1, have committed or are committing a serious breach of any term or condition of a grant made to them under Section 12 or 12B of the Further and Higher Education Scotland Act 2005, have committed or are committing repeated breaches of such terms and conditions, have failed or are failing to provide or secure the provision of education of such standard as the Scottish Ministers consider appropriate, 4, have failed or are failing to exercise any of their other functions properly, 5, have mismanaged or are mismanaging their financial or other affairs, or B, a relevant funding body has informed the Scottish Ministers of the College of Further Education, whose Board of Management is established in pursuance of this part, is not or is no longer a body for which there are suitable provisions, procedures and arrangements of the type described by or under Section 7.2 of the 2005 Act. Each of those seems to me to be an utterly reasonable issue under which these provisions could be taken. What's more, they would require an order to be taken, which would have parliamentary scrutiny. What's more, they would be subject to parliamentary scrutiny. And what's more, they could be subject to judicial review. In all those circumstances, these are things that opposition spokespeople frequently urge ministers to intervene on. And in those circumstances, I think they're utterly reasonable. They are the right things to be in this bill, and they lead to better management and governance.
Can I ask about, within Brzezinski's report, he mentions the issue of increasing the number of women on college court. Can I ask if there will be steps within the bill to move that forward significantly? Or within the Code of Governance? Sorry.
Well, I read the Herald piece this morning, and I also read your question where you, to the chairs of court, where you listed the chairs of court. And I do think there's now time for considerable room for improvement. I will consider at stage 2 whether an amendment should be laid to actually take that a step further. I know the suggestion is that there should be a proportion or percentage, and I will actively consider that.
Would you care to elaborate? Are you minded to move in that direction
I'm minded to
and to legislate?
Well, I'm minded to consider very seriously, Mr. Finlay, that as an issue. I think it is stark, the situation that we have. I think that it is alarming that we are still in that situation, and I am treating it very seriously indeed. I don't want to give a commitment today because I'm only thinking about it at the moment, but I take it very seriously indeed, and I think you're right to raise it, and we will see where that leads us.
One final point, and that's in relation to collective bargaining for an FE. Can I ask what the situation is there?
Yep, the regional leads are taking this forward with my support. There remains an absolute commitment to make that happen. The question of how it is made to happen during the process of merger is actively being discussed. I have encouraged the regional leads to enter into the earliest possible discussions with the trades unions to make sure that they make progress on that, and I hope they will do so. In fact, they will do so.
So just pursue that slightly. Why are the regional leads taking a lead in this? Because I thought it was going to be national collective bargaining.
And it is, and they represent together all the regions that are involved. And what they have to do, because they will, their successors in office will be the people who will take responsibility for each area. In those circumstances, they're the right people to be involved. But they have my backing in it, and there should be negotiation on how it is done. The question is not whether to do it. That's settled, in my view. The question is how it is done, how we go from where we are to the national terms and conditions. We need to do that, and I hope we can find the best way to do it over the quickest period of time.
Is there a timescale?
Sorry. Well, I want it to be done. I don't know what the timescale is. I would like it to be done, and it needs to be done. It is part of the commitment I have entered into, and I want it to happen.
Okay, thank you.
Just one final question, if I may, Cabinet Secretary. The Subordinate Legislation Committee has quite rightly reported to this committee its view on the delegated powers within the bill. And I'm not going to go through all of them, you'll be pleased to hear this morning or this afternoon now, but could you give us a broad overview of what your reaction is to the Sub-Leg Committee's view? Because in many of the powers it believes that the bill as currently drafted provides insufficient scrutiny of those powers and recommends moving from negative to affirmative, and even talks about super affirmative in some cases.
Well, I think there's one issue in which we've already agreed that we agree with the committee. The rest are under active consideration, and I'm happy to come back and as we get to that stage say what we're proposing to do, but we're taking it very seriously and looking at it very carefully. Some of the views I don't agree with, but those where we've already agreed, we've indicated.
Well, I'm sure that both the good work of the Finance Committee and the Suffrage Committee will form part of our report at stage one, along with all the other evidence we have received. And can I end this morning's session by thanking you?
Could I make a point on that? Obviously,
Yes.
if there are points on either of those you would like answers to that have not been dealt with by the committee the day before you report, we are, of course, willing to provide that.
Well, the committee will discuss that under the next agenda item, and I'm sure if there are such matters, we will write to you. But thank you very much for you and your officials for coming here this morning. And can I close the session? Sorry, can I suspend the session? Oh, sorry, no, I do apologise. We're going into private session now, so I close it to members of the public.